Welcome to History Teller YT, where we dive deep into the events that shaped our world. Today, we journey back to 1956, to one of the most dramatic moments of the 20th century, the Suez Crisis. Imagine a canal so vital that the fate of nations hinges upon it. Picture Egypt, a nation freshly independent, standing against the combined might of Britain, France, and Israel. This is more than a story of tanks and diplomacy. It is a tale of power, nationalism, global politics, and the emergence of a new world order during the Cold War. From a nationalization of the Suez Canal by Gamal Abdel Nasser to the rapid military campaigns, superpower interventions, and the rise of post-colonial movements, we will explore every angle of this crisis. We will uncover how the world watched as Egypt challenged global powers, how international media shaped perception, and how this event forever altered the balance of global influence. Stay with us through every segment, because this isn't just history. It's a story of strategy, survival, and sovereignty that still resonates today. By the end of this journey, you'll see the Suez Crisis not just as a regional conflict, but as a pivotal moment that redefined nations, diplomacy, and global power forever. So, settle in, because History Teller YT is about to take you through every twist, turn, and revelation of the Suez Crisis. In the early 1950s, Egypt was a nation at the crossroads of history, its destiny shaped by centuries of foreign influence and imperial ambitions. The British had maintained a strong presence in Egypt since the late 19th century, controlling the Suez Canal and significant portions of the economy, while France, with its historical ties through the Levant, sought influence over Egypt's political affairs. Against this backdrop, a rising tide of nationalism was sweeping through the country. Gamal Abdel Nasser, a charismatic officer in the Egyptian army, emerged as a symbol of this movement. He represented the frustrations of a nation yearning to reclaim its sovereignty, to shake off the shackles of colonial influence, and to assert itself on the global stage. His vision of a united, independent Egypt appealed to the masses, who had grown weary of foreign dominance and internal corruption. The 1952 Egyptian Revolution, which overthrew King Farouk, created the perfect opportunity for Nasser and his fellow officers to reshape the nation's future. Yet the question remained: how could Egypt assert its independence without provoking the entrenched powers of Britain and France, whose interests were deeply intertwined with the Suez Canal and the region's strategic positioning? For decades, the Suez Canal had been a vital artery of global trade, linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea and beyond. It was more than a passage for ships. It was a symbol of control over the flow of resources and a tool of geopolitical influence. Britain, in particular, relied on the canal for its oil supplies and colonial communications. The United States, while not a colonial power in the region, viewed the canal through the lens of Cold War dynamics, seeking to prevent Soviet expansion in the Middle East. Nasser understood the canal's importance and saw nationalization as both a bold assertion of sovereignty and a strategic necessity. By controlling the canal, Egypt could leverage its position in international politics and finance its ambitious modernization plans. Yet such a move would inevitably provoke a reaction from the established powers, setting the stage for a confrontation that would reverberate far beyond Egypt's borders. Nationalism, strategic geography, and Cold War geopolitics were converging, creating a tinderbox situation that would soon erupt into international crisis. The early signs of tension were visible in Egypt's domestic and foreign policies. Nasser initiated ambitious infrastructure projects, land reforms, and a modernization program that aimed to strengthen Egypt economically and militarily. He sought to balance relations with both the United States and the Soviet Union. playing the superpowers against one another to secure aid and technical assistance. This delicate diplomacy, however, was viewed with suspicion by Britain and France, who feared the loss of influence and control over a region that had been under their sway for over half a century. Within this complex tapestry of power, ambition, and resistance, the stage was set for a confrontation that would not only define Egypt's future, but would also reshape the geopolitics of the Middle East. By 1956, the tension had reached a breaking point, and Nasser's next move would ignite a chain of events that would engulf multiple nations in one of the most dramatic crises of the post-World War II era. On July 26, 1956, Nasser made the historic and daring announcement that would become the spark for international conflict. He declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal. This decision was unprecedented in its audacity and far-reaching in its implications. The canal, previously controlled by the Suez Canal Company, which was predominantly French and British-owned, represented both economic and strategic leverage. Nationalizing it meant that Egypt would now control all revenues generated by its operation, estimated at around $100 million annually, funds that Nasser intended to use to finance the construction of the Aswan High Dam, a massive infrastructure project crucial for controlling the Nile, generating hydroelectric power, and ensuring agricultural stability. For Nasser, the move was a statement of independence, a declaration that Egypt would no longer be subject to foreign dictates or exploitation. It was a bold step toward consolidating national pride, economic autonomy, and political authority. For ordinary Egyptians, the announcement was met with jubilation. It symbolized the reclaiming of national dignity after centuries of foreign interference. However, the announcement sent shockwaves through Europe and the global political arena. Britain and France viewed the nationalization as a direct threat to their interests and prestige. The canal was more than a commercial waterway. It was a lifeline connecting Europe to Middle Eastern oil, the Indian subcontinent, and beyond. Losing control of the canal meant not only a loss of revenue, but also a strategic setback at a time when Cold War tensions made every global choke point critical. In London and Paris, policymakers debated swift action to counter what they perceived as Nasser's overreach. The idea of allowing a nationalist, potentially Soviet-leaning leader to control such a vital asset was intolerable. In Israel, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion also watched closely. Israel had long-standing security concerns regarding Egypt, including border skirmishes and the blockade of the Straits of Tiran. Nasser's assertiveness only intensified Israeli fears that Egypt could dominate regional waters and hinder its maritime commerce. The United States, led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, adopted a cautious stance. While sympathetic to Egypt's right to sovereignty, Washington was wary of destabilizing the region and provoking a confrontation with its European allies. Eisenhower and his administration understood the delicate balance required, supporting decolonization and nationalist movements in the Middle East without pushing Britain and France into unilateral military action, which could escalate tensions with the Soviet Union. Nasser's nationalization of the canal thus became a flashpoint in international diplomacy, triggering a complex web of reactions. The world watched with bated breath as Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt navigated the choppy waters of negotiation, threat, and strategy. The stage was now set for the Suez Crisis, a dramatic collision of national ambition, colonial legacy, and Cold War geopolitics that would leave a lasting imprint on the modern Middle East. The Suez Crisis did not occur in isolation. It unfolded at the height of the Cold War, a time when every regional conflict had the potential to escalate into a global confrontation. Nasser's bold nationalization immediately drew attention from the Soviet Union. which viewed Egypt as a potential ally in the Arab world. The Kremlin offered political support and the promise of military and economic aid, positioning itself as the defender of anti-colonial movements. For Nasser, the Soviet overtures were an opportunity to strengthen his bargaining position and secure the resources necessary for Egypt's ambitious development plans. Yet the involvement of the Soviet Union also raised the stakes considerably. Britain and France, both deeply invested in preserving their global influence, feared that any concession to Nasser could embolden Soviet influence in the Middle East, a region critical for oil supplies and strategic positioning. For them, the crisis was not merely about a canal or national pride. It was a pivotal moment in the ongoing contest for global supremacy. Israel, sharing a border with Egypt and having experienced repeated hostilities, had its own interests. The blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba by Egypt and repeated Fedayeen attacks from Egyptian territory made Israeli policymakers anxious to curb Nasser's growing power. Discussions in Jerusalem and London led to a secret understanding. If Egypt's assertiveness threatened Israel's security, a coordinated military response could be justified. France, still smarting from its loss of influence in North Africa after the Algerian War, saw an opportunity to reassert itself in the Middle East alongside Britain. The planning for military intervention, however, had to navigate the delicate international environment carefully. An open attack risked condemnation from the United States and possible intervention by the United Nations. Diplomats and military planners worked behind closed doors, balancing strategic objectives with the necessity of maintaining plausible deniability and controlling the narrative in global media. Meanwhile, Nasser skillfully used international public opinion to his advantage. He portrayed his actions as a fight against colonial exploitation, a narrative that resonated not only in the Arab world but across Asia and Africa, where many nations were undergoing decolonization. Newspapers from Cairo to Jakarta celebrated Egypt's assertion of sovereignty, framing the Suez Canal issue as a larger struggle between emerging nations and entrenched colonial powers. Within this tense environment, every diplomatic cable, military maneuver, and public statement carried immense weight. The Suez Crisis was becoming a high-stakes game, where each move could trigger a cascade of consequences affecting regional stability, superpower relations, and the future of post-colonial states. The world had entered a pivotal moment, with Egypt at the epicenter of a storm that would test the limits of diplomacy, military strategy, and national resolve. In the aftermath of Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, the British and French governments were plunged into a state of urgent deliberation. London and Paris recognized that allowing Egypt to control the canal without a response would not only be an economic blow, but also a symbolic defeat, undermining their global authority. For Britain, the canal was a lifeline connecting the mother country to its oil-dependent industries and its remaining colonies in Asia and Africa. Any interruption in traffic or loss of revenue could destabilize an already fragile post-war economy. France, meanwhile, had its own set of concerns. The Algerian War of Independence had sapped French resources and morale, and Paris was determined not to appear weak in the eyes of its allies or in front of the world's emerging post-colonial nations. Both governments feared that Nasser's triumph could inspire nationalist movements across the Middle East and North Africa, potentially threatening their remaining imperial interests. The stakes were both economic and geopolitical, and the urgency of response was palpable in the corridors of power. Behind closed doors, military and political leaders in London and Paris began to coordinate contingency plans. The idea of immediate diplomacy was quickly dismissed as insufficient. Nasser's popularity, both domestically and internationally, meant that a mere negotiation might be seen as a sign of weakness, encouraging him to further challenge European influence. The governments debated the range of options available: economic sanctions, international legal appeals, and covert operations. Yet there was a growing consensus that only a decisive show of force could secure the canal and reassert authority. Discussions between British Prime Minister Anthony Eden and French Premier Gamal revealed an alignment of objectives: to remove Nasser from the equation, or at least diminish his power, ensure uninterrupted access to the canal, and protect the credibility of their nations on the global stage. This was a delicate dance of power, as both countries had to balance the need for action with the risk of escalating tensions into a full-blown international confrontation. While political leaders orchestrated high-level strategies, military planners worked tirelessly on operational contingencies. Intelligence reports on Egypt's defenses, troop movements, and air capabilities were analyzed in detail. British and French forces began preparing for rapid deployment, considering amphibious landings, airborne assaults, and coordinated naval maneuvers. The planning was meticulous, down to the level of troop numbers, ammunition requirements, and coordination with allies. Yet despite the detailed preparation, there remained a crucial variable: Israel. Britain and France knew that a direct military intervention without local support would be far riskier. The solution lay in forming a strategic alliance with a regional actor who shared their security concerns, creating a pretext for action that could be justified internationally. In this complex chessboard of diplomacy, military strategy, and global perception, Britain and France were carefully positioning themselves for what they hoped would be a swift and decisive resolution to the Suez Crisis. Israel, situated on Egypt's northeastern border, viewed Nasser's assertiveness with alarm. For years, the two nations had clashed over border skirmishes, infiltration by Fedayeen militants, and control of strategic waterways. The blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba was particularly problematic, as it restricted Israel's maritime trade and threatened economic stability. The nationalization of the Suez Canal intensified Israeli fears that Egypt could dominate regional shipping routes, making Israel vulnerable to both economic and military pressure. These concerns were not just hypothetical. Nasser's rhetoric frequently included calls for the destruction of Israel, amplifying fears among Israeli policymakers that waiting for a purely diplomatic solution would leave the country exposed. In response, Israel began to explore options for preemptive or coordinated action that would secure its strategic position and protect its territorial and economic interests. Israeli officials, including Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, initiated secret discussions with their counterparts in London and Paris. These negotiations were complex, as Israel had to be careful not to appear as the aggressor while ensuring that its security concerns were addressed. The discussions produced a plan that was both audacious and highly strategic. Israel would launch a military incursion into the Sinai Peninsula, provoking a crisis that could justify intervention by British and French forces under the pretense of separating the warring parties and securing the canal. The plan required precise coordination, secrecy, and timing. Israel's military, known for its discipline and efficiency, was confident in its ability to execute a rapid strike and achieve objectives before international condemnation could fully materialize. This partnership between European powers and a regional actor revealed the intricate web of alliances and the lengths to which nations were willing to go to protect perceived vital interests. From Jerusalem's perspective, the collaboration with Britain and France offered multiple advantages. It provided legitimacy to their military actions, ensured logistical and tactical support, and created the opportunity to neutralize a hostile neighbor under the guise of broader international intervention. For Israel, the stakes were existential. For Britain and France, They were strategic and symbolic. Together, these actors were shaping the framework for a crisis that would test international diplomacy, military coordination, and the limits of global tolerance for intervention. What unfolded in the months following Nasser's announcement would not merely be a localized conflict over a waterway. It would become a defining moment in the Middle East, highlighting the intersection of nationalism, colonial legacy, and Cold War geopolitics. While Britain, France, and Israel finalized their strategies, the United States and the Soviet Union were observing the developments with growing concern. President Eisenhower, cautious and pragmatic, recognized the potential for the Suez Crisis to escalate into a broader Cold War confrontation. Washington's position was nuanced. While sympathetic to Egypt's right to assert control over its sovereign resources, the U.S. also sought to maintain strong relations with its European allies and ensure that the strategic flow of oil from the Middle East remained uninterrupted. American diplomats engaged in intense back-channel communications, emphasizing the need for restraint, urging negotiations, and warning of the political and economic fallout of unilateral military action. Eisenhower's administration also feared that an aggressive British-French intervention could push Nasser closer to the Soviet Union, potentially allowing Moscow to expand its influence in the region, a scenario the United States was determined to avoid. On the other side, the Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, was quick to recognize an opportunity. Moscow publicly expressed support for Egypt's sovereignty, condemning imperialist designs and pledging diplomatic and military backing if necessary. Soviet propaganda framed Nasser's actions as a victory for anti-colonial movements worldwide, resonating with audiences in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Kremlin's involvement escalated the stakes dramatically, signaling that any attempt by Britain, France, or Israel to intervene militarily could provoke a broader confrontation between the superpowers. Both London and Paris were acutely aware of this risk, yet they believed that careful planning, secrecy, and a limited operation could achieve their objectives without triggering direct superpower conflict. The Suez Crisis was rapidly evolving from a regional dispute into a global flashpoint, where every move was scrutinized and every miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, Nasser demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill, capitalizing on the superpower rivalry to fortify his position. By presenting himself as a leader defending the rights of an independent nation against imperialist aggression, he garnered sympathy from the non-aligned world, projecting an image of strength and legitimacy. At the same time, he subtly signaled that Egypt could accept peaceful negotiations if its sovereignty and economic interests were respected. This delicate balancing act underscored Nasser's strategic acumen. He was not merely reacting to foreign threats, but actively shaping the international discourse, manipulating perceptions, and preparing to confront an alliance of nations far more powerful than his own. By late summer of 1956, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, with Egypt, Israel, Britain, France, and the superpowers all positioned for the unfolding Suez Crisis. On October 29, 1956, the carefully orchestrated plan unfolded as Israeli forces launched a full-scale invasion of the Sinai Peninsula. The operation, codenamed Kadesh, was designed to achieve rapid territorial gains while simultaneously provoking a response that could justify British and French intervention under the guise of enforcing a ceasefire and securing the Suez Canal. The Israeli military demonstrated remarkable precision and coordination. Paratroopers, armored divisions, and air support units were deployed in a synchronized strike that aimed to cut off Egyptian forces, seize key positions, and establish control over the strategic coastal road leading to the canal. Within hours, Israeli units had advanced tens of miles into Egyptian territory, overwhelming local defenses that were caught off guard by the speed and efficiency of the attack. Egyptian forces, though determined, were unprepared for the scale and coordination of the Israeli offensive. Nasser's army consisted of a mix of conscripts and professional soldiers, equipped with Soviet-supplied weapons, but it had not anticipated an assault of this magnitude. Defensive positions along the Sinai were quickly breached, and Egyptian troops began to retreat in an effort to regroup further inland. The psychological impact of the invasion was profound. It not only shocked the Egyptian military, but also galvanized the nation's resolve to resist foreign aggression. Across Cairo, citizens were mobilizing, volunteering for civil defense, and organizing support for the military. Nasser, fully aware of the stakes, delivered impassioned radio addresses, calling for national unity and framing the Israeli invasion as part of a broader conspiracy against Egypt's sovereignty. The invasion also highlighted Israel's strategic calculations. By provoking a crisis, the Israeli government ensured that Britain and France could intervene militarily without appearing as the primary aggressors. This delicate manipulation of the situation demonstrated the sophistication of Israeli strategy and its understanding of global political optics. International observers watched with growing alarm as Israel's forces advanced rapidly, capturing towns, roadways, and critical supply routes. The invasion set in motion a chain of events that would draw multiple powers into a conflict that, while initiated locally, had immediate global implications. The Sinai campaign was not just a military maneuver. It was the first act in a high-stakes international drama that tested the limits of diplomacy, the rules of war, and the balance of power in the Middle East. In the wake of Israel's advance, Britain and France quickly mobilized their naval and air forces in the Mediterranean, ready to intervene under the pretext of enforcing a ceasefire and protecting international shipping through the Suez Canal. On October 30th, 1956, London and Paris issued a joint ultimatum to Egypt and Israel, demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of forces from the Canal Zone. The ultimatum was carefully worded. While ostensibly aimed at stopping the conflict, it implicitly assumed that Nasser's refusal would justify a military intervention to secure the canal and protect international peace. The political calculus was clear. Britain and France sought to frame their intervention as a neutral peacekeeping action, masking the underlying motive of regaining control over a vital economic and strategic asset. Egypt's response was defiant. Nasser rejected the ultimatum outright, framing it as a thinly veiled attempt to subvert Egyptian sovereignty. In Cairo, radio broadcasts emphasized that the canal belonged to Egypt and that foreign powers had no legitimate claim to intervene. Nasser's rhetoric resonated across the Arab world, fueling nationalist sentiment and galvanizing support for Egypt. The refusal provided Britain and France with the justification they sought, enabling them to launch a limited military campaign that would avoid initial international backlash while still projecting the appearance of lawful intervention. In London and Paris, planners were acutely aware of the diplomatic risks, particularly the potential reaction of the United States and the Soviet Union. Contingency plans were refined, with naval bombardments, airborne landings, and rapid troop deployments meticulously timed to coincide with Israel's advances in the Sinai. The ultimatum also revealed the complex interplay between public perception and military strategy. Both governments engaged in a campaign of public messaging, emphasizing the protection of international shipping and the maintenance of global order. Newspapers in Britain and France highlighted the disruption to trade and framed Nasser as a reckless, destabilizing figure. Meanwhile, secret communications with Israeli leaders ensured that the timing of military actions would maximize political leverage, forcing Nasser into a position where resistance could be painted as defiance of international norms. The stage was set for a dramatic escalation. The carefully choreographed sequence of invasion and intervention underscored the interwoven nature of military tactics, diplomacy, and international propaganda in shaping the unfolding crisis. As Israel advanced and Britain and France positioned themselves for intervention, Nasser faced the most critical test of his leadership. With the eyes of the Arab world upon him, the Egyptian president understood that failure to respond decisively could result in not only territorial loss, but also a catastrophic blow to his credibility and the broader nationalist movement. Nasser called an emergency session of the Egyptian High Command, convening generals, ministers, and advisors to coordinate a national defense strategy. Despite initial setbacks in the Sinai, he emphasized the importance of maintaining morale, both among the troops and the civilian population. Propaganda campaigns were launched across Cairo, broadcasting messages of resilience and unity, portraying Egypt as the defender of Arab sovereignty against imperialist aggression. Egyptian military forces were reorganized under a strategy of strategic defense and attrition. While Israel had the advantage of surprise and momentum, Nasser focused on slowing their advance, fortifying key positions along the Suez Canal and preparing defensive lines in the northern Sinai. The use of anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and mobile artillery units exemplified Egypt's adaptive tactics. Simultaneously, Nasser coordinated with Soviet advisors who provided strategic guidance, intelligence updates, and promises of logistical support. The president also reached out diplomatically to non-aligned countries, highlighting Egypt's struggle as emblematic of the fight against colonialism and foreign domination. This appeal to international public opinion proved effective, garnering widespread sympathy across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe, complicating Britain and France's diplomatic position. Within days, Egypt became a nation in wartime mode. Civilians contributed to fortifications, volunteered in hospitals, and participated in civil defense programs. Nasser's speeches emphasized national pride and collective sacrifice, framing the conflict as an existential struggle that extended beyond borders. The Egyptian media highlighted the bravery of soldiers and citizens alike, creating a narrative of heroic resistance that contrasted sharply with the foreign powers' military machinery. By the end of the first week of hostilities, the Suez Crisis had transformed from a localized dispute over a canal into a full-blown military, political, and psychological confrontation. Nasser's ability to rally a nation against superior forces demonstrated both his leadership and the deep-rooted power of nationalism in shaping the course of events. The world now faced a complex and volatile scenario, with multiple actors, competing agendas, and the looming specter of superpower involvement. On October 31st, 1956, Britain and France launched Operation Musketeer, a meticulously planned but controversial military intervention aimed at regaining control of the Suez Canal and curbing Nasser's growing influence. The operation was presented to the world as a peacekeeping effort. The ultimatum issued to Egypt and Israel demanded a ceasefire and the withdrawal of forces from the canal area. When Nasser predictably refused, London and Paris justified military action as necessary to protect international shipping lanes and maintain stability. Behind the diplomatic facade, however, the true objectives were clear: reassert European dominance, secure economic interests, and prevent Nasser from becoming a symbol of anti-colonial success in the Arab world. The operation began with extensive naval bombardments, targeting Egyptian airfields, radar stations, and strategic infrastructure. British and French aircraft patrolled the skies, conducting precision strikes designed to weaken Egypt's defensive capabilities while minimizing civilian casualties, though in reality, the air campaign inflicted significant disruption and destruction. Simultaneously, naval forces moved into position near Port Said, preparing amphibious landings along the canal zone. These forces included elite units trained for rapid deployment, backed by heavy artillery and air support. Military planners anticipated resistance, but expected that Egypt, despite Nasser's efforts at mobilization, could be subdued quickly by superior firepower and coordination. The initial stages of the invasion shocked the world. For many in Egypt, it was an unmistakable act of aggression, a stark reminder of European imperial ambitions despite decades of decolonization rhetoric. Cairo's streets buzzed with tension as citizens and reservists were called to support defensive efforts. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and government communiques portrayed the invasion as a battle for national survival, emphasizing heroic resistance against technologically superior forces. International reactions varied. Some European nations cautiously supported the intervention, while the United States and the Soviet Union expressed deep concern over escalating violence. Operation Musketeer had officially begun, but the unfolding events would reveal that military superiority alone could not guarantee political success in a conflict of such global significance. Despite being outmatched technologically and numerically, Egyptian forces mounted a resilient defense against the Anglo-French assault. Strategic coordination between ground troops, anti-tank units, and artillery emplacements slowed the amphibious advance along the Suez Canal. Egyptian troops utilized the terrain to their advantage, fortifying positions near key towns and choke points, and employing guerrilla-style tactics to disrupt enemy movements. Every mile of territory gained by the British and French came at a high cost, both in lives and material. Civilian volunteers assisted in fortifications, transported supplies, and provided medical aid, reinforcing the national narrative of a collective struggle against foreign invaders. The human cost of the invasion quickly became apparent. Casualties mounted on both sides, with civilian areas near the canal suffering from bombardments and crossfire. Hospitals in Port Said and surrounding towns were overwhelmed, while international news outlets broadcast images of destruction, fueling outrage and sympathy for Egypt. Nasser's government capitalized on these images to galvanize both domestic and regional support, portraying the conflict as a David and Goliath struggle between a newly independent nation and established European powers. Propaganda and morale-building efforts strengthened public resolve, making it clear that military occupation would not be easily accepted. Nasser's leadership and communication strategy proved as critical to the defense as the soldiers on the front lines, highlighting the interplay between military operations and psychological resilience in modern warfare. Meanwhile, British and French forces faced logistical and operational challenges. Despite superior firepower, coordination issues, harsh desert terrain, and Egyptian resistance slowed their advance. Commanders struggled to maintain momentum while avoiding civilian casualties that could provoke further international condemnation. Moreover, the unfolding invasion attracted intense global scrutiny. Diplomatic pressure from the United States began to mount, signaling that while London and Paris had achieved tactical success, they were increasingly isolated politically. The initial military victories were only the beginning. Sustaining control over the Suez Canal and managing the international fallout would prove far more challenging than anticipated. The Anglo-French invasion of Egypt ignited immediate diplomatic turmoil. The United States, caught between support for decolonization and alliance obligations, rapidly condemned the operation. President Eisenhower's administration viewed the intervention as a reckless gamble that risked not only Middle Eastern stability, but also the broader balance of power in the Cold War. Washington feared that aggressive action by Britain and France could push Nasser into the arms of the Soviet Union, providing Moscow with strategic influence over the region. In an unprecedented show of diplomatic pressure, the U.S. threatened economic measures, including withholding financial support to Britain, and called for an immediate ceasefire. Washington's insistence on restraint demonstrated a new reality. Even European powers with historical global influence could no longer act unilaterally without facing consequences from emerging superpowers. The Soviet Union responded with fierce rhetoric, condemning the invasion as imperialist aggression and issuing veiled threats of intervention. Khrushchev's government promised to provide Egypt with military and logistical support, including potential missile deployment, raising fears of a wider conflict that could involve direct superpower confrontation. Public demonstrations erupted in major cities worldwide, from Moscow to Cairo to New Delhi, reflecting the intense global attention and ideological polarization surrounding the crisis. International organizations, including the United Nations, mobilized quickly. The Security Council convened emergency sessions, calling for a ceasefire and highlighting the urgency of resolving the conflict diplomatically. In Cairo, Nasser's leadership benefited from the global spotlight. His refusal to yield under foreign pressure positioned him as a hero of the non-aligned world. Diplomatic channels were flooded with offers of mediation and support, while regional Arab nations rallied behind Egypt's sovereignty. The crisis underscored a critical lesson of the post-World War II order. Military power alone was insufficient to dictate outcomes in a world increasingly shaped by global opinion, superpower influence, and multilateral institutions. Britain and France, despite initial military success, were confronted with a complex geopolitical reality that would force them to reconsider the limits of force and the importance of international legitimacy. The Suez Crisis had escalated from a regional conflict to a defining moment in Cold War diplomacy, with far-reaching implications for the Middle East and beyond. By early November 1956, the international reaction to the Anglo-French-Israeli intervention in Egypt had reached a critical stage. While Britain and France had achieved tactical successes on the ground, their strategic position was rapidly deteriorating due to global political pressure. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, had emerged as a decisive actor in the crisis. Washington's approach was a careful blend of diplomacy, economic leverage, and moral authority. Eisenhower's administration viewed the invasion as an unnecessary and destabilizing use of force by former colonial powers at a time when global decolonization was accelerating. The message to London and Paris was unambiguous: halt the offensive or face severe political and economic consequences. The economic dimension of U.S. pressure was particularly significant. The American government controlled access to international financial markets critical for Britain and France. Washington threatened to withhold loans and credit guarantees that were essential for stabilizing post-war European economies. The British pound was vulnerable, and any disruption in financial assistance could trigger economic turmoil at home. Similarly, France, still grappling with the economic strains of the Algerian War and Reconstruction, faced the prospect of isolation from key international lenders. Eisenhower's strategy relied not on military threats, but on demonstrating the tangible costs of continued aggression. By leveraging financial influence, the U.S. transformed what was initially a European military operation into a high-stakes economic and diplomatic dilemma, forcing London and Paris to weigh the human and economic costs of escalation against the political imperative of preserving prestige and influence. At the same time, American diplomacy was reinforced by persuasive multilateral advocacy. Washington worked closely with the United Nations and allied nations to frame the conflict as a violation of international norms. The U.S. emphasized that while Israel's concerns were legitimate, Britain and France's direct military intervention went far beyond the scope of peacekeeping or humanitarian necessity. Through a combination of behind-the-scenes negotiations, public statements, and economic leverage, the United States successfully positioned itself as the arbiter of restraint, demonstrating the emerging post-World War II power structure. Former colonial powers could no longer act unilaterally without facing superpower oversight. The Suez Crisis thus became a clear demonstration of how diplomacy, economic influence, and global opinion could converge to shape the course of modern conflicts. The Suez Crisis also marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of the United Nations as a global mediator and peacekeeping body. As the invasion intensified, the Security Council convened emergency sessions to address the rapidly deteriorating situation. Both superpowers, despite their ideological rivalry, recognized the necessity of a multilateral approach to prevent further escalation. UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld acted swiftly, proposing a ceasefire and the establishment of a multinational peacekeeping force to stabilize the region. His initiative was historic. It would become the first large-scale deployment of a UN peacekeeping operation in a conflict zone, setting a precedent for future international interventions. Hammarskjöld's proposal called for the immediate withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli forces from Egyptian territory, while creating a neutral UN presence to secure key areas, particularly around the Suez Canal. This plan placed Britain and France in a precarious position. Militarily, they had momentum, but politically and diplomatically, they faced mounting pressure to yield. Nasser, astutely aware of the opportunity, embraced the UN initiative, positioning himself as a responsible and cooperative actor in the international community. By accepting the UN plan, he projected an image of moral authority, contrasting sharply with the aggressive posture of the European powers. Across the globe, nations observing the crisis saw Egypt's defiance framed within the broader principles of sovereignty, anti-colonialism, and international law. The deployment of UN forces was both symbolic and practical. Thousands of peacekeepers, including personnel from neutral countries, were stationed along critical points of the canal, tasked with overseeing the ceasefire, assisting displaced civilians, and monitoring troop withdrawals. The presence of the UN added a layer of legitimacy and reduced the likelihood of further unilateral military action. Britain and France, facing this new reality, began to reassess their objectives. Continued resistance risked alienating allies, provoking superpower retaliation, and undermining the moral justification of their operation. The Suez Crisis had transformed from a regional military confrontation into a test of international institutions, highlighting the growing importance of global governance and multilateral diplomacy in resolving conflicts that threaten peace and stability. As U.S. pressure and UN diplomacy gained traction, Nasser emerged as the clear victor in the geopolitical and propaganda dimensions of the Suez Crisis. Despite being militarily challenged, he had skillfully navigated international politics to achieve objectives that extended beyond mere survival. The UN ceasefire and the eventual withdrawal of British and French forces validated his stance on Egyptian sovereignty and demonstrated the effectiveness of combining military resistance with strategic diplomacy. Across the Arab world, Nasser's popularity soared. He was celebrated not only as a national hero, but also as a symbol of Arab unity and defiance against foreign interference. Nasser's diplomatic strategy was multi-layered. Domestically, he emphasized national pride and resilience, framing the crisis as proof of Egypt's emerging strength and independence. Regionally, he cultivated alliances with other Arab nations, reinforcing his leadership in the Arab League and positioning Egypt as a central power in Middle Eastern politics. Internationally, he skillfully engaged with both the superpowers. By appealing to the principles of sovereignty and anti-colonialism, Nasser garnered sympathy from non-aligned nations, while maintaining pragmatic relations with both the United States and the Soviet Union. This balancing act enhanced Egypt's global standing and allowed Nasser to secure economic and military aid without becoming a pawn of either Cold War bloc. The outcome of the Suez Crisis had far-reaching implications. Britain and France, despite superior military capabilities, were forced to withdraw, signaling the decline of traditional European influence in the Middle East. Israel achieved short-term tactical gains, but faced diplomatic isolation and international scrutiny. The crisis demonstrated the growing importance of global opinion, superpower influence, and multilateral institutions in determining the outcomes of regional conflicts. For Nasser and Egypt, it was a historic triumph. Sovereignty was preserved, national pride was reinforced, and a new era of leadership and regional influence had begun. The Suez Crisis thus stands as a defining moment in 20th century history, illustrating how strategy, diplomacy, and national resolve can converge to reshape the balance of power. By November 1956, the tide of international pressure had decisively turned against Britain, France, and Israel. Despite their initial military successes, all three nations faced an unsustainable political and diplomatic situation. The United States, exercising both economic and political leverage, insisted on a withdrawal to avoid further destabilization and to prevent the crisis from escalating into a potential Cold War confrontation. Washington's warnings were coupled with the threat of financial sanctions, including a freeze on loans to Britain and potential intervention in global currency markets, making it increasingly clear that continued occupation of Egyptian territory carried severe consequences. Additionally, UN resolutions demanding a ceasefire and the removal of foreign troops created a multilateral mandate that reinforced Nasser's position. Under this pressure, Britain and France reluctantly agreed to pull their forces back, coordinating the withdrawal with UN peacekeeping operations to ensure that a vacuum did not lead to further chaos. The withdrawal required careful logistical planning, as both nations sought to extract troops, equipment, and material while minimizing casualties and avoiding further public relations disasters. For Israel, the withdrawal was similarly complicated. The Sinai campaign had achieved its tactical objectives, but international condemnation and U.S. pressure forced Israeli forces to retreat to pre-conflict positions. Despite having demonstrated military prowess, Israel now faced the challenge of reconciling short-term battlefield gains with long-term diplomatic isolation. The withdrawal marked a turning point, illustrating that in the emerging post-war world order, military victories could not guarantee political legitimacy without international support and cooperation. The retreat of foreign troops had profound implications for the Middle East. For Egypt, it was a symbolic and practical victory. Sovereignty over its territory and the Suez Canal was reaffirmed, national pride surged, and Nasser's political authority was solidified. For Britain and France, the withdrawal represented a humiliating setback, signaling the waning influence of traditional European powers in the post-colonial era. Moreover, the operation exposed the limits of unilateral action, emphasizing the growing importance of multilateral institutions, superpower diplomacy, and global public opinion. The Suez Crisis had become a definitive lesson in the interplay between force, legitimacy, and diplomacy in shaping the international order of the 20th century. The deployment of UN peacekeeping forces was unprecedented in both scale and significance. Under Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, the United Nations launched the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, to monitor the ceasefire, facilitate the withdrawal of invading troops, and secure critical points along the Suez Canal. This marked the first time the UN had undertaken a major peacekeeping mission with armed personnel, signaling a new role for the organization in maintaining international stability and resolving conflicts that threaten global peace. The UNEF operation included troops from neutral countries such as Canada, Brazil, India, and Sweden, whose presence reinforced the legitimacy and impartiality of the mission. The peacekeepers faced immediate challenges. The terrain along the canal was harsh, with desert conditions, limited infrastructure, and ongoing sporadic skirmishes posing operational difficulties. Despite these obstacles, UNEF successfully established checkpoints, patrolled strategic positions, and facilitated humanitarian assistance to civilians affected by the conflict. The presence of international observers helped prevent renewed hostilities, ensuring that local forces adhered to the ceasefire and providing a mechanism for accountability. For the Egyptian government, UNEF's deployment was a welcome buffer, allowing Nasser to consolidate his control over the Sinai and focus on national reconstruction. It also enhanced Egypt's international standing by demonstrating cooperation with a global institution while preserving sovereignty and territorial integrity. The success of UNEF had far-reaching implications. It demonstrated that multilateral peacekeeping could stabilize volatile regions, reduce immediate conflict, and provide a framework for diplomatic solutions. The operation became a model for future interventions, illustrating that the United Nations could play an active and meaningful role in global security. For the world, it represented a new era in which regional disputes could no longer be resolved solely by military force. International oversight, diplomacy, and cooperative security mechanisms had become essential. The Suez Crisis, once a symbol of imperial confrontation, thus transformed into a landmark case study for the potential of multilateral peacekeeping in modern international relations. With the withdrawal of foreign forces and the stabilization provided by UN peacekeepers, Egypt entered a period of post-crisis recovery that would redefine its domestic and regional standing. Nasser emerged from the crisis as a national hero and a symbol of Arab resilience and independence. His ability to resist a coalition of European and regional powers, maintain sovereignty over the Suez Canal, and garner international recognition significantly enhanced Egypt's political legitimacy. Domestically, Nasser focused on rebuilding the economy, repairing infrastructure damage during the conflict, and advancing development projects such as the Aswan High Dam, which became both a symbol of national pride and a strategic asset for controlling the Nile and generating electricity. Regionally, the Suez Crisis elevated Egypt's influence across the Arab world. Nasser's defiance inspired nationalist movements in countries like Syria, Iraq, and Algeria, fostering a sense of pan-Arab unity that positioned him as a central figure in Middle Eastern politics. The crisis also reshaped regional alliances, as nations recognized that collective resistance against external pressures could yield tangible results. Egypt's strengthened position allowed Nasser to champion initiatives, such as the Arab League's increased cooperation on economic and military matters, further solidifying his leadership role. Internationally, Egypt's standing was enhanced not only in the Arab and non-aligned world, but also within global diplomacy. By skillfully leveraging UN mechanisms, negotiating with superpowers, and maintaining domestic cohesion, Nasser demonstrated a new model of leadership for post-colonial states. The crisis underscored the limitations of traditional European powers and highlighted the importance of strategic diplomacy, public opinion, and international institutions. For decades to come, the Suez Crisis would be remembered not merely as a military confrontation, but as a turning point in global geopolitics, illustrating how a determined and strategically savvy leader could alter the balance of power and assert national sovereignty in the complex web of Cold War and post-colonial politics. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a pivotal turning point in the global balance of power, particularly for the European colonial powers of Britain and France. The intervention, initially conceived to reassert control over the Suez Canal and regional dominance, ended in diplomatic humiliation and strategic retreat. Britain and France realized that the post-World War II international landscape had shifted irrevocably. Military might alone could no longer guarantee influence, particularly in regions where nationalist movements and Cold War dynamics intersected. The crisis revealed the vulnerabilities of Europe's remaining imperial ambitions, highlighting the growing importance of superpower oversight, international opinion, and multilateral institutions. For Britain, the withdrawal from Egypt exposed both political and economic fragility. Prime Minister Anthony Eden faced severe criticism at home for miscalculating international reactions, particularly the forceful opposition from the United States. Washington's insistence on halting the invasion and threatening economic measures, including the potential sale of U.S. reserves of the pound sterling, underscored London's dependence on global financial and diplomatic support. Eden's prestige suffered irreparably, and the Suez Crisis accelerated Britain's gradual retreat from the Middle East, signaling a shift toward a more limited and pragmatic foreign policy. Similarly, France confronted a dual crisis: military overreach abroad and the ongoing struggle to maintain control in Algeria. The failure to achieve its objectives in Egypt weakened Paris's regional authority and underscored the limitations of European power in the face of emerging nationalist movements. The decline of Britain and France in the Middle East had broader implications for post-colonial geopolitics. Nationalist movements across Asia, Africa, and the Arab world took note of Egypt's success in resisting foreign domination. The crisis demonstrated that determined leadership, coupled with strategic diplomacy and international engagement, could challenge established powers. In this way, the Suez Crisis was both a cautionary tale for traditional colonial states and a source of inspiration for nations seeking sovereignty and self-determination. The failure of Britain and France to control the outcome signaled the end of an era in which European empires could exert unilateral influence in regions that had long been under their sway. The Suez Crisis also significantly influenced the strategic calculations of the United States and the Soviet Union, reinforcing the centrality of the Cold War in global geopolitics. For the United States, the crisis highlighted the importance of restraining European allies to prevent the escalation of regional conflicts that could inadvertently expand Soviet influence. Eisenhower's administration emphasized the emerging principle that post-colonial conflicts needed to be addressed diplomatically rather than militarily, particularly in areas critical to global energy supplies, such as the Middle East. By exerting economic and political pressure on Britain, France, and Israel, Washington demonstrated its capacity to shape international outcomes without direct military involvement, establishing a precedent for superpower engagement in regional disputes. The Soviet Union, for its part, initially capitalized on the situation to bolster its global image. By supporting Nasser diplomatically and threatening intervention, Moscow projected itself as a champion of anti-colonialism and protector of emerging nations. Khrushchev's rhetoric framed the crisis as a struggle between imperialist powers and sovereign states, enhancing Soviet influence among non-aligned nations. While the USSR ultimately avoided direct military confrontation, its involvement sent a clear message that Cold War stakes extended beyond Europe and Asia, encompassing strategically vital regions such as the Middle East. The crisis thus reinforced the superpowers' role as ultimate arbiters of conflict in a multipolar world where regional disputes could no longer be isolated from global strategic considerations. The Cold War implications of the Suez Crisis also influenced military planning, alliances, and arms policies. Nations in the Middle East, including Egypt, recognized the importance of balancing relations with both superpowers to secure aid, technology, and political support. Nasser skillfully leveraged this dynamic, obtaining military and economic assistance while maintaining a position of non-alignment. The crisis illustrated that emerging nations could navigate the superpower rivalry to their advantage, achieving strategic gains without succumbing to domination. In this sense, the Suez Crisis was not only a regional conflict, but also a demonstration of how the Cold War reshaped global politics, creating both opportunities and constraint for states in the developing world. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of the Suez Crisis was the enhancement of Gamal Abdel Nasser's prestige and the rise of Arab nationalism. By successfully confronting Britain, France, and Israel, Nasser solidified his image as a leader capable of defending national sovereignty and challenging entrenched foreign interests. Across the Arab world, Nasser's defiance inspired a wave of political mobilization, fostering regional solidarity and a shared sense of identity that transcended individual national borders. Governments, intellectuals, and activists in countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Algeria looked to Egypt as a model of how regional leadership could be exercised effectively in the post-colonial era. Nasser's handling of the crisis demonstrated a combination of military strategy, diplomatic acumen, and media savvy. By appealing to the United Nations, engaging with both superpowers, and maintaining national cohesion, he transformed a moment of vulnerability into a triumph of legitimacy and influence. His speeches, radio broadcasts, and public appearances emphasized Egyptian pride, sovereignty, and the broader struggle against imperialism, solidifying his role as the preeminent voice of Arab nationalism. The crisis also accelerated Egypt's modernization initiatives, as Nasser sought to capitalize on his strengthened political position to implement social, economic, and infrastructural reforms, reinforcing the nation's stability and capacity for leadership. The Suez Crisis ultimately reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East. It demonstrated that post-colonial states could assert influence independently of former colonial powers, particularly when combining strategic diplomacy with domestic legitimacy. Nasser's success challenged traditional hierarchies, inspired nationalist movements, and set a precedent for regional leadership grounded in sovereignty and resilience. The crisis became a defining episode in the history of the Arab world, illustrating the interplay of nationalism, global politics, and strategic calculation in shaping the course of modern Middle Eastern history. The Suez Crisis presented Israel with a complex mixture of tactical success and strategic dilemmas. Militarily, the Israeli Defense Forces had achieved their immediate objectives in the Sinai Peninsula, demonstrating exceptional operational capacity through rapid armored maneuvers, airborne operations, and coordinated ground offensives. Key towns and strategic positions have been seized, supply lines disrupted, and Egypt's military initiative weakened, at least temporarily. The invasion validated Israel's doctrine of preemption, showing that decisive military action could provide tangible advantages when threats to security were perceived as imminent. However, these military gains came at a significant cost. International condemnation, particularly from the United States and the United Nations, isolated Israel diplomatically. Washington's insistence on withdrawal highlighted the limits of unilateral action, emphasizing that even in matters of national security, global opinion and superpower alignment had become essential considerations. Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, faced the urgent task of reconciling battlefield achievements with a broader political reality. Sustained occupation or further aggression could jeopardize Israel's relationships with crucial allies, risk economic repercussions, and provoke superpower intervention. The crisis prompted a comprehensive reassessment of Israel's military and foreign policy. The invasion had demonstrated both the effectiveness of preemptive action and the vulnerabilities inherent in international isolation. Israel recognized that while tactical victories were achievable, long-term strategic security required careful balancing of military capability with diplomatic engagement. Consequently, Israeli leadership initiated a period of reflection and recalibration, emphasizing intelligence gathering, regional alliances, and negotiation with both Western powers and emerging Middle Eastern actors. The lessons of the Suez Crisis would inform Israel's approach to future conflicts, reinforcing the principle that military success alone was insufficient without political legitimacy and international support. The aftermath of the Suez Crisis reverberated throughout the Middle East, reshaping political dynamics and regional alignments. Across the Arab world, Nasser's successful resistance against Britain, France, and Israel became a symbol of empowerment and inspiration. Governments and nationalist movements in countries such as Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Algeria drew lessons from Egypt's diplomatic and military strategy. Nasser's defiance demonstrated that regional powers, even when militarily outmatched, could leverage international opinion, multilateral institutions, and superpower rivalries to achieve political objectives. This surge of pan-Arab sentiment had profound consequences. Nationalist movements advocating independence and sovereignty gained momentum, challenging both colonial legacies and local monarchies perceived as compliant with Western powers. Nasser emerged as a unifying figure, able to articulate the aspirations of a region long subjected to foreign intervention and political fragmentation. His speeches, broadcasts, and diplomatic efforts emphasized solidarity, resistance, and the strategic importance of regional cohesion. Across capitals from Damascus to Baghdad, citizens and policymakers alike regarded Egypt's actions as a template for asserting autonomy and confronting foreign dominance. Israel's invasion and the subsequent Anglo-French intervention also exacerbated tensions with neighboring states. Arab governments, emboldened by Egypt's survival and rising nationalist sentiment, adopted more assertive positions in international forums and bilateral relations with Israel. Military planning, border fortifications, and coordination among Arab militaries intensified, setting the stage for heightened regional security concerns. The Suez Crisis thus catalyzed a profound transformation in Middle Eastern politics. The region became increasingly interconnected, ideologically aligned around anti-colonialism and nationalism, and acutely conscious of the influence of superpower politics on local disputes. For Israel, this meant that the strategic environment had shifted, requiring more nuanced diplomacy, regional engagement, and long-term planning to navigate an increasingly hostile and ideologically mobilized neighborhood. The Suez Crisis highlighted the centrality of superpower intervention in regional conflicts, particularly in the context of the Cold War. The United States' decisive economic and diplomatic pressure had forced Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw, demonstrating Washington's capacity to influence outcomes without deploying military force. For the Soviet Union, the crisis provided an opportunity to project influence in the Arab world, supporting Egypt diplomatically and threatening intervention to assert its global stature. Both superpowers recognized the strategic importance of the Middle East, not only as a source of vital energy resources, but also as a theater where global ideological influence could be contested. In response to the crisis, the United States strengthened its diplomatic engagement with Middle Eastern states, balancing support for Israel with initiatives aimed at securing oil supplies and encouraging stability. Programs of economic aid, military assistance, and political mediation were intensified, establishing a long-term pattern of U.S. involvement that would shape the region's geopolitical landscape for decades. Conversely, the Soviet Union's support for Nasser allowed Moscow to cultivate alliances and expand its presence in the Middle East without direct military confrontation, reinforcing the importance of ideological and diplomatic influence alongside conventional power projection. The Cold War context profoundly affected regional security calculations. Israel had to navigate a delicate balance, maintaining security against hostile neighbors while avoiding actions that might provoke superpower intervention. Arab states, inspired by Nasser's defiance and aware of U.S.-Soviet competition, increasingly leveraged superpower rivalry to secure aid, weapons, and political backing. The Suez Crisis underscored that regional conflicts could no longer be isolated. Their outcomes were intertwined with global strategic considerations. In this sense, the crisis marked a new era in Middle Eastern geopolitics, where national ambitions, regional solidarity, and superpower interests intersected to shape the course of history, establishing patterns of diplomacy, military strategy, and ideological alignment that would endure for decades. The Suez Crisis reverberated far beyond the Middle East, sending shockwaves through global economic systems and highlighting the vulnerability of international trade to geopolitical upheaval. The Suez Canal, a vital maritime artery connecting Europe to Asia, had been disrupted, resulting in immediate delays and significant financial losses for countries reliant on Middle Eastern oil and trade. Shipping companies faced rerouted journeys around the Cape of Good Hope, dramatically increasing travel time, operational costs, and the risk of maritime hazards. For industrialized nations, particularly Britain, France, and Germany, the interruption threatened energy supplies, industrial production, and commercial stability. Oil prices surged, creating inflationary pressures that were compounded by the broader uncertainty surrounding European political stability and the reliability of global trade routes. Britain, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil for its post-war reconstruction, experienced acute economic stress. The interruption in the flow of crude oil intensified concerns about energy security, revealing the fragility of the nation's reliance on external sources. Stock markets reacted nervously, while the British government faced mounting domestic criticism for its military overreach and the resulting economic consequences. Similarly, France, still grappling with the costs of the Algerian conflict, found its economic projections disrupted by rising energy costs and the instability caused by the military intervention. Countries far removed from the conflict, including the United States and nations in Western Europe, experienced cascading effects in energy prices commodity markets, and maritime insurance premiums. The crisis illuminated the interdependence of global trade and the far-reaching consequences of regional conflicts in an increasingly interconnected world economy. Beyond the immediate disruption to trade, the Suez Crisis prompted governments to reassess long-term strategies for securing critical infrastructure. Energy policies were scrutinized, and alternative shipping routes and oil supply diversification became urgent priorities. The crisis demonstrated that military might alone could not guarantee control over strategic resources when global economic, political, and diplomatic factors were at play. In effect, the Suez Crisis became a case study in the intersection of geopolitics and economics, illustrating how regional conflicts could ripple through global markets, reshape energy security strategies, and influence national economic planning for decades. The Suez Crisis underscored the geopolitical centrality of oil in global politics. The disruption of the canal exposed the vulnerability of oil-dependent economies to regional conflicts and highlighted the strategic leverage of resource-rich nations. For Egypt, Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal was not merely a political act, but also a calculated assertion of economic sovereignty. Control over the canal allowed Egypt to dictate the terms of maritime passage, collect revenues essential for development, and leverage its strategic position in negotiations with both regional and global powers. This newfound leverage enabled Egypt to assert greater autonomy in its foreign relations. Nasser used the canal as both a symbol and a practical instrument of national power, demonstrating that economic control could translate into political influence. By managing the canal and securing its revenues, Egypt could finance infrastructure projects, support its military modernization, and enhance its international standing. The canal's importance also gave Nasser a bargaining tool in interactions with the United States, the Soviet Union, and neighboring Arab states. Nations seeking uninterrupted access to the canal had to engage diplomatically, granting Egypt an opportunity to expand its influence and negotiate favorable terms while asserting sovereignty over a historically contested resource. Globally, the Suez Crisis reshaped perceptions of energy security. Western nations recognized that political instability in the Middle East could directly threaten industrial output and economic stability, prompting long-term strategic planning to mitigate reliance on vulnerable choke points. Pipelines, alternative routes, and regional alliances became central considerations in the formulation of foreign policy and economic strategy. In essence, the crisis elevated oil from a mere commodity to a critical instrument of national power and strategic negotiation. Nasser's successful defense of Egypt's interests demonstrated the transformative potential of resource control in shaping both regional and global political landscapes, reinforcing the interplay between economics, diplomacy, and national sovereignty. Following the withdrawal of foreign forces and stabilization under UN peacekeeping, Egypt embarked on a period of reconstruction and development, fueled by the revenues and strategic leverage obtained from the Suez Canal. Nasser prioritized rebuilding infrastructure damage during the conflict, including ports, railways, and urban centers along the canal. The government invested in modernizing transportation networks, enhancing communication systems, and expanding public services to support economic recovery and national cohesion. Civilian morale, bolstered by the perceived victory over foreign intervention, facilitated mass mobilization for reconstruction projects, including workforce initiatives and community-based infrastructure repair. The canal's revenues provided a financial backbone for ambitious national development plans, most notably the Aswan High Dam, which was envisioned as a transformative project for controlling the Nile, generating electricity and expanding agricultural production. By leveraging the symbolic and economic victory of the Suez Crisis, Nasser was able to secure international loans, technical assistance, and political support for long-term initiatives that would cement Egypt's modernization. The reconstruction period also included reforms aimed at diversifying the economy, investing in industrial production, and strengthening social services, reflecting a comprehensive approach to consolidating the nation's stability and resilience. Beyond domestic reconstruction, Egypt's experience during the Suez Crisis enhanced its diplomatic and regional influence. By demonstrating the ability to resist superior military powers and assert control over strategic economic assets, Nasser set a precedent for other developing nations. The crisis illustrated that sovereignty, resource control, and strategic diplomacy could be leveraged to achieve developmental and political objectives simultaneously. In the broader Middle Eastern context, Egypt's recovery inspired nationalist movements, strengthened regional alliances, and established Nasser as a leading figure in Arab and non-aligned politics. The Suez Crisis, therefore, was not only a military and political turning point, but also a catalyst for economic modernization and regional leadership, shaping the trajectory of Egypt and the Middle East for decades to come. The Suez Crisis of 1956 unfolded in an era when mass media was beginning to play a decisive role in shaping international perceptions of war, politics, and diplomacy. Unlike previous conflicts, where information was tightly controlled and slow to circulate, the rapid dissemination of news through radio broadcasts, newspapers, and newsreels ensured that events in the Middle East were observed in near real time across the globe. Media outlets became not only chroniclers of the conflict, but also active participants in shaping narratives, influencing public opinion, and exerting pressure on governments. For the invading powers, Britain, France, and Israel, media coverage quickly became a double-edged sword. Initial reports of military successes highlighted the efficiency and coordination of their operations, bolstering domestic support for the interventions. Newspapers in London and Paris framed the campaigns as necessary actions to secure international trade routes and protect strategic assets, portraying Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal as reckless and destabilizing. Similarly, Israeli media celebrated the Rapid Sinai campaign, emphasizing military prowess and operational precision. However, as images of destruction, civilian casualties, and the humanitarian consequences of the conflict began to emerge, international scrutiny intensified, undermining the moral authority of the invading powers. The juxtaposition of military victory with widespread suffering created a complex narrative that governments struggled to control. Egypt, under Nasser's leadership, capitalized effectively on international media to bolster its position. Cairo radio broadcasts, press releases, and carefully curated visual coverage presented the Egyptian military and civilian population as heroic defenders of national sovereignty. Reports emphasized resilience, strategic ingenuity, and the moral high ground, framing the conflict as a struggle between imperialist powers and an emerging, self-determined nation. International journalists covering the crisis amplified these narratives, particularly as images of destroyed infrastructure and displaced civilians circulated worldwide. This media exposure generated sympathy for Egypt, catalyzed anti-colonial sentiment in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and intensified diplomatic pressure on Britain and France to halt their operations. The crisis thus underscored the growing power of media as both a strategic tool and a critical determinant in shaping international outcomes during modern conflicts. Propaganda emerged as a central feature of the Suez Crisis, deployed extensively by all sides to influence domestic morale, regional sentiment, and global opinion. For Egypt, propaganda was instrumental in consolidating national unity and maintaining public resolve in the face of superior military forces. Nasser's speeches, broadcasts, and visual messaging emphasized the notion of a united nation defending its sovereignty against external aggression. Radio Cairo frequently highlighted stories of civilian volunteers, heroic military maneuvers, and acts of solidarity, reinforcing a narrative of moral superiority and resilience. Posters, leaflets, and public demonstrations amplified these messages, ensuring that the population remained committed to the national cause while projecting strength to external audiences. Britain and France also engaged in sophisticated propaganda campaigns aimed at justifying their intervention. Official communications emphasized the protection of international shipping, the enforcement of peace, and the maintenance of global order. Visual media highlighted precision strikes, disciplined troop movements, and orderly evacuations to convey the message that military actions were controlled, measured, and necessary. Newspapers, radio programs, and government communiques were coordinated to frame the operation in terms of legality, responsibility, and the restoration of stability. However, the effectiveness of these campaigns was limited by the broader dissemination of images and reports portraying the humanitarian cost of the conflict. International audiences increasingly questioned the motives of Britain and France, undermining the credibility of their messaging. Psychological warfare extended beyond domestic propaganda. Egyptian forces implemented tactics to undermine enemy morale, including deceptive maneuvers, feigned retreats, and controlled broadcasts aimed at creating confusion among invading troops. Nasser's government strategically leaked information to international media to shape global narratives, portraying the Anglo-French-Israeli coalition as aggressors undermining international norms. The interplay between traditional military operations and information warfare demonstrated the evolving nature of conflict, where perception, narrative control, and media strategy became nearly as important as battlefield tactics. The Suez Crisis became a defining example of how propaganda and psychological operations could influence international diplomacy, alter the trajectory of military campaigns, and redefine the contours of modern warfare. The Suez Crisis illuminated the unprecedented role of global public perception in determining the outcome of international conflicts. Across Europe, the United States, the Middle East, and beyond, ordinary citizens and opinion leaders closely monitored the unfolding events, shaping diplomatic pressures in ways that had never been possible in previous decades. In Britain and France, public opinion was divided. Initial support for protecting national interests and strategic assets gave way to widespread criticism as images of civilian casualties and international condemnation mounted. Mass protests, critical editorials, and parliamentary debates reflected growing awareness that military intervention could no longer be conducted in isolation from global scrutiny. Internationally, the crisis galvanized support for Nasser and Egypt, particularly among non-aligned nations, newly independent states, and regions still under colonial influence. Governments in Asia and Africa expressed solidarity with Egypt, framing the conflict as a struggle against imperialism and asserting the principle of national sovereignty. International organizations, including the United Nations, responded to this widespread concern by advocating for ceasefires, mediating negotiations, and facilitating the deployment of peacekeeping forces. The visible global backlash against Britain and France demonstrated that moral authority, legitimacy, and public perception had become as crucial as military capability in determining outcomes in the modern era. For policymakers, the Suez Crisis highlighted a fundamental truth. Global opinion could amplify or constrain national strategies, influence the behavior of superpowers, and shape the trajectory of regional conflicts. Nasser's adept use of media and international public support turned Egypt's defensive struggle into a symbolic victory with far-reaching diplomatic consequences. Britain and France, despite their superior firepower, were forced to retreat, illustrating that military force alone could not secure political objectives when global scrutiny, superpower intervention, and public sentiment coalesced against it. The Suez Crisis thus represented a transformative moment in the history of media, propaganda, and international diplomacy, demonstrating the growing power of perception in shaping the outcomes of modern geopolitical crises. The Suez Crisis of 1956 offered profound military lessons for all parties involved, revealing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of modern armed forces in complex regional conflicts. For Britain and France, the operation underscored the importance of precise planning, rapid deployment, and technological superiority, yet it also highlighted the limitations of conventional military power in the face of political, economic, and international constraints. Despite successful amphibious landings, air superiority, and coordinated operations, both nations faced significant logistical challenges. Harsh desert terrain, extended supply lines, and the need to avoid civilian casualties complicated tactical maneuvers, slowing advances and testing the operational resilience of troops. Israel's military campaign similarly demonstrated the effectiveness of preemptive strategy and rapid armored operations. The Israeli Defense Forces executed highly coordinated assaults across the Sinai Peninsula, combining mechanized units, paratroopers, and aerial support to disrupt Egyptian defenses. The campaign validated Israel's doctrine of swift, decisive action in response to perceived security threats. However, the strategic limitations were equally apparent. Operational success on the battlefield could not compensate for diplomatic isolation or the necessity of international legitimacy. Israel had to withdraw under pressure, highlighting the interconnected nature of military, political, and diplomatic considerations in modern conflict. For all three nations, the Suez Crisis emphasized the critical importance of intelligence, communication, and coordination across different branches of the military. The campaign highlighted how technological advantage, such as advanced aircraft, tanks, and naval capabilities, was insufficient when not coupled with adaptive strategy and a clear understanding of the political context. The lessons learned from Suez prompted subsequent reforms in military doctrine, emphasizing the integration of conventional force with strategic foresight, diplomatic awareness, and the management of global perception. In essence, Suez became a case study in modern warfare, demonstrating that military victories were inseparable from the broader political, economic, and informational landscape. The Suez Crisis also provided invaluable insights into the role of technology in mid-20th century warfare. The conflict saw the first large-scale integration of modern jet aircraft, mechanized armored units, and advanced communications technology in a coordinated regional campaign. British and French air forces deployed sophisticated fighter bombers and reconnaissance planes, demonstrating the importance of air superiority in shaping ground operations. Israeli forces effectively combined mechanized armor with tactical mobility, highlighting how innovative operational planning could amplify the impact of limited resources. These technological applications inform post-crisis military modernization programs across all involved nations. In addition to hardware, the crisis illustrated the strategic significance of real-time intelligence and rapid decision-making. Both sides relied on aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and battlefield communications to monitor troop movements and adjust tactics dynamically. The effectiveness of these systems underscored a growing trend in modern warfare. The integration of technology with operational planning and strategic foresight was as critical as numerical strength or conventional firepower. For Britain and France, the Suez experience revealed gaps in logistical coordination, highlighting the need for better supply chain management and infrastructure support in expeditionary campaigns. Israel, recognizing the diplomatic limitations of military action, began emphasizing the synchronization of tactical prowess with international negotiation and alliance management. The strategic recalibration prompted by the Suez Crisis extended beyond immediate military reform. Defense planners in Europe and Israel reevaluated the interaction between force projection, geopolitical constraints, and global perception. The limitations of conventional superiority were evident. Military gains could be nullified if they contradicted political realities or incurred international censure. The crisis became a foundation for modern doctrines integrating technology, rapid mobility, and operational innovation with the necessity of achieving objectives within an acceptable political and diplomatic framework. These lessons would resonate in future conflicts, from the Arab-Israeli wars to NATO operations during the Cold War, cementing Suez as a pivotal reference point in military strategy and planning. Beyond technological and tactical lessons, the Suez Crisis forced all parties to recalibrate their strategic approach to regional conflicts, acknowledging the inseparability of military action, diplomacy, and international oversight. Britain and France, despite superior firepower, recognized that unilateral intervention was untenable in an era dominated by superpower influence and multilateral institutions. The political fallout and economic pressure exerted by the United States demonstrated that conventional military might could be constrained by broader global dynamics, reshaping European defense and foreign policy strategies in the post-colonial era. Lessons from Suez influenced subsequent European military planning, emphasizing coalition building, diplomatic engagement, and the prudent use of force in overseas operations. Israel, meanwhile, adapted its strategic doctrine to account for the dual imperatives of security and international legitimacy. While preemptive strikes and rapid armored campaigns had proven tactically effective, the need to maintain superpower support, avoid regional isolation, and secure international recognition became equally critical. Israel's recalibration included an increased focus on intelligence, diplomacy, and coordination with allies, anticipating that future conflicts would be evaluated not only on military outcomes, but also on global political consequences. The Suez experience instilled a nuanced understanding that battlefield success must be integrated with careful management of alliances, public perception, and the strategic interests of influential powers. For Egypt and Nasser, the crisis confirmed the value of combining military resistance with strategic diplomacy and international engagement. The ability to withstand superior forces while leveraging UN mechanisms and superpower rivalries reinforced Egypt's position as a regional power. Nasser's success encouraged other emerging nations to explore similar strategies of balancing military preparedness with political negotiation and multilateral support. Across the Middle East, the Suez Crisis catalyzed new thinking about national security, sovereignty, and regional influence, highlighting that strategic success required not only force, but also careful navigation of the interconnected political, economic, and diplomatic landscape. The conflict thus left a lasting legacy, shaping military doctrines, diplomatic strategies, and international relations for decades to come. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a watershed moment not only for Middle Eastern geopolitics, but also for the evolution of international peacekeeping. The conflict presented a unique challenge to the United Nations. How could a newly established international body effectively intervene in a regional conflict without direct enforcement power? The solution was the creation of the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, a multinational peacekeeping contingent designed to monitor ceasefires, separate warring parties, and ensure compliance with UN resolutions. This operation was unprecedented in scale, composition, and mandate, representing the first time the United Nations deployed an armed force to maintain peace rather than merely observe or mediate. Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, played a pivotal role in conceptualizing and operationalizing UNEF. Recognizing the delicate political environment, he advocated for a neutral, multinational force composed of personnel from countries not directly involved in the conflict. This neutrality was critical to establishing legitimacy and ensuring that neither side perceived the force as biased or threatening. Troops from countries such as Canada, Brazil, Sweden, and India were selected for their perceived impartiality, providing a buffer between Egyptian forces and the withdrawing Anglo-French-Israeli coalition. The mission was a delicate balancing act. Peacekeepers had to maintain authority without escalating tensions, all while navigating logistical challenges, harsh desert terrain, and the operational complexities of coordinating multiple national contingents with different languages, doctrines, and military traditions. The establishment of UNEF set a precedent for future UN interventions, demonstrating that a multilateral, neutral force could successfully stabilize volatile situations. The operation required innovative approaches to command and control, supply chain management, and rules of engagement, laying the foundation for modern peacekeeping doctrine. UN observers and peacekeepers acted as both physical and symbolic agents of international authority, ensuring compliance with ceasefires and demonstrating the potential of multilateral governance in conflict resolution. The Suez Crisis, therefore, was not only a military and diplomatic turning point, but also a seminal moment in the institutional development of international peacekeeping, influencing the design and deployment of future UN operations worldwide. Deploying UNEF along the Suez Canal and the Sinai Peninsula presented operational challenges that tested the limits of international coordination and logistical planning. The peacekeepers were tasked with maintaining separation between Egyptian forces and the withdrawing British, French, and Israeli troops while monitoring adherence to ceasefire agreements. Harsh desert conditions, limited infrastructure, and the constant risk of sporadic skirmishes demanded rigorous planning and adaptability. Supply lines were stretched, communication networks had to be rapidly established, and contingents from diverse military traditions had to coordinate effectively under a unified command structure. The experience highlighted the importance of clear mandates, impartiality, and adaptability in peacekeeping operations. Rules of engagement had to balance the use of force with the necessity of restraint, ensuring that peacekeepers could act decisively when necessary without exacerbating tensions. Coordination between civilian UN officials and military personnel proved essential for operational success, as both had to navigate the overlapping realms of humanitarian needs, political negotiation, and military logistics. The challenges faced during the Suez deployment informed the development of standard operating procedures for subsequent UN missions, emphasizing flexibility, cultural sensitivity, and the need to integrate local knowledge with international oversight. UNEF's success demonstrated that international intervention could achieve tangible results without direct combat, a critical innovation in global conflict management. It showcased the potential for neutral forces to stabilize conflicts, protect civilians, and facilitate diplomatic solutions. Moreover, the Suez mission emphasized that peacekeeping was not a passive endeavor. It required proactive engagement, strategic communication, and an ability to anticipate and prevent escalation. The lessons learned from UNEF became foundational in shaping the principles and practices of modern peacekeeping, influencing operations in Cyprus, the Congo, and later in complex post-Cold War conflicts. Suez established that the United Nations could move beyond moral authority to operational effectiveness, bridging the gap between international law and the realities of conflict management. The Suez Crisis left a lasting legacy on the international system by proving the viability and importance of UN peacekeeping in a world increasingly dominated by superpower influence and regional conflicts. UNEF's deployment demonstrated that multilateral institutions could intervene successfully in disputes where traditional diplomacy and unilateral action had failed. This not only enhanced the credibility of the United Nations, but also reassured smaller nations that global norms and collective security mechanisms could protect sovereignty and prevent unilateral aggression. The symbolic impact of UN peacekeepers was profound. They represented an international commitment to law, order, and neutrality, creating a stabilizing effect that transcended the immediate operational zone. Beyond the Middle East, the Suez mission influenced global security doctrine and shaped expectations for international conflict resolution. Countries emerging from colonial rule recognized the UN as a potential safeguard against interference from more powerful nations. The crisis also set a precedent for the use of peacekeeping forces to facilitate the withdrawal of foreign troops, manage humanitarian crises, and oversee post-conflict reconstruction. For policymakers in Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris, the operation illustrated that military interventions could no longer occur without multilateral oversight, highlighting the growing importance of legitimacy and perception in global politics. In the decades that followed, the lessons from UNEF informed UN interventions in conflicts across Asia, Africa, and the Balkans. The Suez Crisis became a touchstone for peacekeeping doctrine, emphasizing neutrality, adaptability, and the integration of military, political, and humanitarian functions. It demonstrated that even in a multipolar, ideologically polarized world, international institutions could exert meaningful influence, mitigate conflict, and create space for negotiation. The crisis thus redefined the possibilities of collective security, establishing a framework for global cooperation that remains central to contemporary peacekeeping missions. The UN's successful management of the Suez intervention cemented its role as a crucial actor in maintaining international stability, demonstrating that diplomacy and multilateral action could achieve what unilateral force alone could not. The Suez Crisis profoundly impacted British domestic politics, triggering a wave of introspection, criticism, and leadership challenges. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had personally championed the military intervention, faced intense scrutiny from Parliament, the press, and public opinion. Initially, many Britons supported the operation, viewing it as a necessary action to protect national interests, secure trade routes, and maintain global prestige. However, as the military campaign faltered under international pressure, particularly from the United States, and images of destruction and civilian suffering spread, public support waned rapidly. The crisis exposed vulnerabilities in Eden's leadership style, including his reliance on opaque decision-making, limited consultation with key cabinet members, and underestimation of international consequences. Eden's authority suffered a significant blow as the economic, diplomatic, and political costs of the crisis became apparent. The British pound was under pressure due to U.S. financial leverage. Trade disruptions affected domestic industries, and the nation's international reputation was severely tarnished. Parliamentary debates grew increasingly hostile, with opposition leaders condemning the government's unilateral actions and demanding accountability. Within the Conservative Party, factions emerged questioning Eden's judgment and the strategic rationale for intervention. The crisis ultimately undermined confidence in Britain's ability to assert unilateral influence in a rapidly changing world, accelerating the nation's post-colonial transition and contributing to Eden's eventual resignation in January 1957. Beyond leadership changes, the Suez Crisis had a lasting effect on British foreign policy and military doctrine. The debacle forced a re-evaluation of imperial ambitions, highlighting the limitations of traditional military power in an era dominated by superpower politics and global media scrutiny. British planners increasingly recognized the need for multilateral cooperation, diplomatic engagement, and careful management of international perception. Suez became a cautionary tale of overreach, illustrating that even a historically dominant power could be humbled when strategic calculations failed to account for economic pressures, alliance dynamics, and the moral dimension of modern conflict. In France, the Suez Crisis similarly triggered political turbulence and exposed tensions between domestic priorities and international ambitions. The Fourth Republic, already fragile and preoccupied with the ongoing Algerian War, faced a significant challenge in managing the repercussions of the intervention. Prime Minister Gamal and other French leaders had supported the operation to protect the Suez Canal, maintain regional influence, and project power alongside Britain and Israel. Initially, there was a sense of confidence in the military strategy, but as international condemnation mounted, particularly from the United States and the United Nations, the French government's position became increasingly untenable. The political fallout manifested in multiple dimensions. The media criticized the government's handling of the crisis, highlighting both strategic miscalculations and ethical concerns. Public demonstrations in Paris and other cities reflected growing unease about the costs of foreign adventures and the moral implications of military aggression. Parliamentary debates exposed divisions within the government, and opposition parties leveraged the debacle to challenge the legitimacy of the Fourth Republic's decision-making processes. The crisis underscored the limits of France's post-war military capacity and the diminishing influence of Europe in global geopolitics, prompting a reassessment of national priorities, defense planning, and foreign policy strategies. Suez also had a profound psychological impact on French national identity and perceptions of prestige. For decades, France had sought to maintain its status as a global power, projecting influence in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The failure to achieve strategic objectives in Egypt, despite superior military resources, was seen as a blow to France's credibility on the international stage. It accelerated debates about decolonization, prompted reforms in military planning, and influenced the eventual political trajectory that led to the establishment of the Fifth Republic under Charles de Gaulle. The crisis illustrated the fragility of power in the post-colonial era and underscored the necessity of aligning military ambition with diplomatic strategy, economic realities, and international norms. For Israel, the Suez Crisis was both a demonstration of military capability and a source of complex domestic political consequences. On the one hand, the Israeli Defense Forces had achieved rapid, tactical success in the Sinai Peninsula, validating the doctrine of preemptive strikes and operational mobility. The campaign enhanced the reputation of military leaders, including Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, and instilled a sense of national pride in demonstrating Israel's ability to confront a numerically superior opponent while safeguarding strategic objectives. Israeli public morale initially soared, and there was widespread recognition of the operational brilliance displayed during the campaign. However, the diplomatic repercussions of the intervention were more challenging to navigate. International pressure, particularly from the United States, forced Israel to withdraw from occupied territories and revert to pre-conflict positions, creating tension between military success and political constraints. Domestic debates emerged regarding the balance between security imperatives and the necessity of maintaining favorable relations with superpowers. Critics argued that the government's reliance on unilateral military action risked long-term isolation, while supporters emphasized the imperative of ensuring national security in a hostile regional environment. These discussions prompted strategic reassessment, with Israeli policymakers increasingly emphasizing the integration of military planning with diplomatic engagement and international legitimacy. The Suez Crisis thus left Israel with enduring lessons about the interplay between force and diplomacy. While the military campaign proved Israel's capability to act decisively, the requirement to accommodate global pressures highlighted the importance of alliances, superpower relations, and careful management of public perception. The domestic political narrative was complex. Israel celebrated tactical achievement, but also confronted the reality that enduring security and regional influence required more than battlefield victories. This duality shaped future Israeli military doctrine, foreign policy, and domestic discourse, reinforcing the need for strategic foresight, coalition management, and nuanced engagement with both regional and global actors. The Suez Crisis of 1956 reshaped the Arab-Israeli conflict and had profound repercussions for regional military dynamics. The rapid Israeli advance into the Sinai Peninsula, followed by international pressure forcing withdrawal, left neighboring Arab states both wary and emboldened. While Egypt emerged with heightened prestige and nationalist legitimacy, other Arab nations, particularly Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, perceived both vulnerabilities and opportunities in the evolving landscape. The crisis demonstrated Israel's military capability, but also its susceptibility to diplomatic and economic constraints, creating a complex calculus for Arab policymakers seeking to balance aggression, deterrence, and regional solidarity. Syria and Iraq, in particular, responded by reinforcing their military capabilities, modernizing their forces, and strengthening strategic alliances with Egypt. Border fortifications were upgraded, intelligence networks expanded, and regional coordination improved to prepare for potential future conflicts with Israel. Arab governments observed Nasser's success in leveraging international opinion and UN mechanisms, realizing that military confrontations alone would not guarantee favorable outcomes. Diplomatic strategy, regional coalitions, and public mobilization became increasingly central to Arab defense planning. This period marked a significant evolution in Arab military doctrine, emphasizing both deterrence and the political dimensions of conflict, acknowledging that Israel's tactical superiority would require careful balancing through regional cooperation and international diplomacy. The Suez Crisis also intensified public mobilization across the Arab world. Citizens in urban and rural centers expressed solidarity with Egypt, participating in rallies, fundraising efforts, and military volunteer initiatives. Nasser's portrayal as a leader defending Arab sovereignty created a unifying narrative, reinforcing nationalist sentiment and solidarity across borders. The psychological impact of the crisis extended beyond Egypt, fostering regional cohesion and a shared perception of external threats. The event catalyzed a long-term transformation in regional security consciousness, demonstrating that military preparedness, national pride, and strategic diplomacy were inseparable in the volatile Middle Eastern environment. Israel emerged from the Suez Crisis with mixed outcomes. While its military capabilities have been demonstrated in the rapid advance into Sinai, the forced withdrawal under international pressure highlighted critical strategic limitations. Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, recognized that military preemption alone could not guarantee long-term security. The interplay of superpower influence, regional alliances, and international diplomacy became clear as central to sustaining Israel's strategic objectives. In response, Israel initiated a comprehensive reevaluation of its military doctrine. Emphasis shifted toward intelligence gathering, border fortification, and rapid mobilization capabilities, ensuring that future confrontations could be managed effectively. The importance of combined arms operations, air-ground coordination, and mechanized maneuverability was reaffirmed, while lessons from logistical and diplomatic constraints informed new planning standards. Israel also strengthened ties with Western powers, particularly the United States, seeking assurances of political support and military aid in exchange for restraint in unilateral operations. The crisis underscored the necessity of integrating military preparedness with broader strategic and diplomatic considerations, shaping Israel's approach to future conflicts, including the 1967 Six-Day War and beyond. Beyond immediate military planning, Israel's leadership recognized the psychological dimension of regional deterrence. The Suez Crisis demonstrated the importance of public perception, both domestically and internationally, in consolidating national security. Israel invested in communication strategies, public diplomacy, and coalition building to reinforce the credibility of its defensive posture. Military readiness became inseparable from strategic messaging, emphasizing deterrence not only through force, but also through perception management. These lessons informed Israel's regional posture for decades, establishing a doctrine where tactical success, strategic foresight, and diplomatic engagement were carefully calibrated to ensure both security and legitimacy. The aftermath of the Suez Crisis prompted an era of intense military modernization and preparation throughout the Middle East. Egypt, emboldened by its successful resistance, accelerated the development of its armed forces, acquiring new weapons systems from the Soviet Union and reorganizing its command structures. Air defense, artillery, and mechanized units were prioritized to strengthen deterrence against potential Israeli incursions. Syria, Iraq, and Jordan followed suit, seeking to upgrade equipment, train personnel, and enhance coordination among Arab militaries. The crisis highlighted the need for comprehensive regional strategy, integrating national defense planning with coalition-based deterrence to offset Israel's operational advantages. The military implications of Suez extended beyond mere troop deployments. The crisis underscored the importance of logistical preparation, infrastructure resilience, and rapid mobilization. Both Israel and Arab states invested heavily in road networks, supply depots, and strategic bases to support future operations. Intelligence services expanded, emphasizing reconnaissance, signal interception, and early warning systems. Military exercises and war games increasingly simulated combined operations, reflecting the lessons learned from Suez about coordination, flexibility, and the importance of operational readiness under politically constrained conditions. Politically, the crisis solidified the perception that military strength and regional diplomacy were inseparable. Arab states recognized that alliances, UN engagement, and international public opinion could amplify the effectiveness of military strategy. Israel, similarly, understood that preemptive capabilities had to be complemented by robust diplomatic ties and credible deterrence. The Suez Crisis thus reshaped the military calculus of the Middle East, establishing a pattern of strategic preparation, technological investment, and coalition building that would dominate regional conflicts for decades. By linking operational capability with political legitimacy, the crisis became a defining moment in the evolution of modern Middle Eastern military and strategic thought. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a pivotal moment in the Cold War, highlighting the United States' increasing influence in the Middle East. Washington's response to the invasion by Britain, France, and Israel demonstrated a new approach to international power projection, one that relied not solely on military force, but also on economic leverage, diplomatic pressure, and multilateral mechanisms. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration prioritized containment of Soviet influence, preservation of global stability, and protection of Western economic interests, particularly access to Middle Eastern oil. The U.S. reaction illustrated that American foreign policy was evolving from distant oversight to direct intervention in strategic theaters, even without deploying combat forces. Washington's approach during the crisis involved a careful calibration of pressure on the European allies while maintaining support for Israel's security. The U.S. threatened economic sanctions, including restrictions on currency reserves and trade, effectively compelling Britain and France to cease military operations. Diplomatically, the United States worked closely with the United Nations to facilitate a ceasefire and the deployment of UNEF, using multilateral mechanisms to stabilize the situation. These actions underscored a critical lesson. Superpower influence could shape the outcome of regional conflicts without direct engagement, leveraging economic, political, and moral authority to achieve strategic objectives. The Suez Crisis also established a template for U.S. engagement in the Middle East for decades to come. American policymakers recognized the delicate balance between supporting regional allies, maintaining access to vital energy resources, and countering Soviet expansion. This realization led to the expansion of aid programs, military assistance, and political initiatives aimed at cultivating influence across the Arab world and Israel. The crisis thus represented a turning point, signaling the emergence of the United States as the primary guarantor of regional stability and a decisive arbiter in Middle Eastern conflicts. The lessons learned shaped both Cold War strategy and U.S. foreign policy doctrine, emphasizing the integration of diplomacy, economic tools, and strategic military positioning in complex geopolitical environments. The Soviet Union's response to the Suez Crisis was equally consequential, revealing the Kremlin's growing interest in Middle Eastern affairs as a theater for ideological and strategic influence. Moscow condemned the Anglo-French-Israeli intervention, portraying the conflict as an example of Western imperialism and a violation of national sovereignty. The Soviets extended political and material support to Egypt, providing diplomatic backing at the United Nations and signaling the willingness to employ military threats, including mobilization and implied intervention to counter Western actions. This stance allowed the USSR to expand its influence in the Arab world and cultivate alliances with governments seeking alternatives to Western dominance. Nasser's Egypt became a central figure in Soviet strategy, serving both as a regional partner and a symbol of anti-imperialist resistance. The Soviet Union offered technical assistance, weapons supplies, and economic aid, creating a pattern of dependency and alignment that would influence Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. Beyond material support, Moscow leveraged ideology and propaganda, portraying the crisis as a victory of national sovereignty over colonial aggression and positioning itself as a defender of developing nations. The Soviet approach underscored the intersection of military aid, political support, and ideological positioning, reinforcing the Cold War principle that local conflicts could serve as arenas for global competition. The superpower involvement during the Suez Crisis fundamentally transformed regional calculations. Middle Eastern nations became increasingly aware of the potential benefits and risks of aligning with either Washington or Moscow. The crisis highlighted that regional actors could use superpower rivalry to their advantage, extracting aid, diplomatic recognition, and security guarantees while maintaining a degree of autonomy. For the United States and the Soviet Union, the Middle East emerged as a critical battleground in the global contest for influence, where access to resources, ideological credibility, and alliance building were as crucial as direct military presence. The Suez Crisis thus accelerated the integration of the Middle East into the broader strategic calculations of the Cold War, shaping alliances, conflicts, and political alignments for decades. In the aftermath of the Suez Crisis, regional alliances and security postures were significantly redefined. Arab states, inspired by Egypt's successful resistance, recognized the potential benefits of collective action and regional solidarity. The Arab League, already a nascent platform for cooperation, became a more prominent forum for military and political coordination. Countries such as Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon sought to strengthen mutual defense arrangements, share intelligence, and develop contingency plans for potential conflicts with Israel. Egypt's leadership under Nasser provided both inspiration and practical guidance, emphasizing the combination of military readiness, political unity, and diplomatic engagement with superpowers. Israel, meanwhile, recalibrated its strategic alliances and defense posture in light of the dual lessons of operational success and international constraints. While the IDF's capabilities were validated in Sinai, the withdrawal under U.S. and UN pressure reinforced the need for strong relationships with global powers, particularly the United States. Israel invested in intelligence, early warning systems, and rapid mobilization strategies, while deepening diplomatic engagement to ensure that future military actions would be supported, or at least tolerated, by influential allies. The crisis highlighted that regional security was inseparable from global political context, and that alliances had to be nurtured not only militarily, but also diplomatically. The broader Middle East became a chessboard of competing interests, where superpower involvement created both opportunities and constraints. Access to military aid, economic assistance, and political recognition was increasingly mediated by U.S.-Soviet competition. Nations in the region learned to navigate this dynamic carefully, balancing autonomy with alignment to maximize security and development outcomes. The Suez Crisis thus accelerated the formalization of Cold War-era alliances, set the stage for subsequent Arab-Israeli confrontations, and underscored the enduring importance of superpower engagement in determining the trajectory of regional politics. By reshaping alliances, security strategies, and diplomatic norms, the crisis had a transformative impact that extended far beyond the immediate military operations of 1956. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had immediate and far-reaching consequences for global trade, highlighting the vulnerability of critical maritime routes to geopolitical conflict. The Suez Canal, a narrow but vital artery connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, accounted for a significant proportion of Europe's trade with Asia, particularly oil, manufacture goods and raw materials. When Egypt nationalized the canal and hostilities erupted, the closure of this essential waterway forced ships to undertake the much longer journey around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles to shipping routes. Transit times increased dramatically, leading to delays, higher insurance premiums, and escalated costs for goods ranging from crude oil to textiles and machinery. European economies, particularly Britain and France, were disproportionately affected by the disruption. Industrial production faced immediate energy constraints as oil imports from the Persian Gulf and the Middle East slowed, triggering temporary shortages, price spikes, and inflationary pressures. Shipping companies were forced to recalibrate logistics, charter additional vessels, and navigate longer, more dangerous maritime passages. Commodities markets reacted with volatility, reflecting the uncertainties inherent in global trade networks dependent on a single strategic choke point. For emerging economies reliant on exports to Europe or the Middle East, the crisis disrupted supply chains, contracted markets, and strained the balance of payments, revealing the fragility of a post-World War II globalized economy. The disruption extended beyond energy and goods. It had cascading effects on financial systems. Currency reserves, credit arrangements, and international loans were recalibrated as governments attempted to mitigate the economic shock. Shipping insurance premiums soared, reflecting both the risks of piracy or mechanical failure on extended routes and the political uncertainties of the region. Ports in alternative locations, such as South African harbors, gained temporary strategic importance, requiring governments to reassess maritime infrastructure investment. The crisis demonstrated that geopolitical instability in a strategically located nation could ripple across the global economy, influencing not only trade volumes, but also financial stability, investment strategies, and economic policy at both national and multinational levels. The Suez Crisis also had profound implications for oil markets, bringing energy security to the forefront of global economic and political strategy. Western Europe, heavily reliant on Middle Eastern oil, experienced sudden supply disruptions, forcing governments and industries to confront the reality that energy dependence could create strategic vulnerabilities. Oil prices surged as uncertainty dominated the market, reflecting both actual shortages and speculative pressures. The crisis revealed that oil was not merely a commodity, but a critical instrument of political leverage, capable of influencing national policies, industrial output, and even the outcome of international conflicts. Britain, in particular, faced an acute energy dilemma. Post-war reconstruction had left the nation dependent on imported oil for electricity, transportation, and industrial production. The crisis forced rapid coordination between the government, private energy companies, and international partners to secure alternative supplies. The United States, leveraging its position as both a major oil producer and a global political actor, exerted pressure to stabilize the flow of petroleum to Europe, highlighting the intersection of energy dependency and superpower diplomacy. France faced similar challenges, exacerbated by ongoing military expenditures in Algeria, creating a dual burden on its economy that fueled public debate over foreign policy and energy policy priorities. In response, governments began to develop long-term energy strategies to mitigate future disruptions. Strategic petroleum reserves, alternative shipping routes, and diversified supply chains became central to national planning. The Suez Crisis accelerated the adoption of pipelines, such as the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, and the exploration of domestic energy sources, reducing reliance on vulnerable maritime choke points. This period also marked the beginning of an era in which energy security would dominate international relations, influencing alliances, trade agreements, and military planning. The crisis demonstrated that control over energy resources, particularly oil, could be as decisive as military might in shaping global power dynamics, embedding energy considerations into the strategic calculus of nations for decades to come. While the Suez Crisis disrupted global trade, it simultaneously catalyzed economic development and infrastructure modernization in the Middle East. Egypt, having nationalized the canal, gained direct revenue from tolls and shipping fees, creating a financial foundation for ambitious national projects. These funds were used to invest in infrastructure reconstruction damaged during the conflict, including ports, roads, and industrial facilities along the canal. The crisis reinforced Egypt's capacity to leverage strategic assets for national development, illustrating how control over critical infrastructure could translate into economic sovereignty and long-term planning. Beyond Egypt, the crisis prompted neighboring countries to reassess their economic and logistical strategies. Nations reliant on maritime trade invested in ports, storage facilities, and transport networks to mitigate vulnerability to future disruptions. Regional coordination in trade and infrastructure became a priority as countries recognized the interdependence of security, economic stability, and strategic planning. Additionally, foreign aid and investment flowed into the Middle East as international powers sought to stabilize the region and secure access to energy resources. This period of investment created lasting improvements in transportation networks, urban development, and industrial capacity, shaping the trajectory of economic modernization in the decades that followed. The economic lessons of the Suez Crisis were both regional and global. It demonstrated that control over critical infrastructure could provide both strategic leverage and financial resources for development, that energy security was inseparable from national strategy, and that regional stability was essential to global economic continuity. Governments worldwide reevaluated trade, energy policy, and contingency planning, recognizing that localized conflicts could produce cascading effects across continents. The crisis left a lasting imprint on economic strategy, influencing policies in Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, and underscored the inseparable link between geopolitics, energy, and economic development in the modern era. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had a profound symbolic and practical impact on post-colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and the broader global South. Egypt's successful nationalization of the Suez Canal and its resistance against Britain, France, and Israel elevated Gamal Abdel Nasser to iconic status, representing the possibility of asserting sovereignty in the face of entrenched colonial powers. For newly independent or soon-to-be independent nations, Egypt's actions demonstrated that strategic vision, nationalism, and adept diplomacy could enable a country to challenge global powers without succumbing to external domination. The crisis reverberated widely among nationalist leaders. In India, Jawaharlal Nehru praised Nasser's stance, seeing it as a parallel to India's own struggle for sovereignty and its attempts to navigate Cold War pressures without losing independence. Across Africa, leaders of countries still under colonial rule perceive the events at Suez as validation of the anti-colonial cause, illustrating that calculated, resolute resistance could alter the global balance of power. This perception invigorated political movements, catalyzed organized resistance against colonial authorities, and encouraged the formation of coalitions dedicated to achieving self-determination. Egypt's ability to leverage UN intervention and superpower dynamics amplified the lesson that international legitimacy, public opinion, and multilateral institutions could be used as tools for post-colonial empowerment. The symbolic resonance of Suez extended to public consciousness through media, literature, and political rhetoric. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and visual imagery presented Nasser as the defender of Arab dignity and a vanguard of anti-imperialism. These narratives shaped the political imagination of the global South, fostering solidarity between nations, inspiring local activism, and embedding anti-colonial sentiment within the geopolitical discourse. The crisis demonstrated that the assertion of sovereignty over strategic assets could have repercussions far beyond borders, encouraging nations to pursue self-determination with both confidence and strategic sophistication. In the years immediately following the Suez Crisis, the example of Egypt significantly influenced decolonization processes in Africa and Asia. In Africa, nationalist movements in countries such as Ghana, Algeria, and Kenya drew lesson from the interplay of military resistance, diplomacy, and international advocacy. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana explicitly referenced Egypt's ability to challenge imperial powers as an inspiration for asserting the political and economic independence of African nations. Similarly, Algerian nationalist movements intensified their campaigns, recognizing that international attention, strategic alliances, and symbolic victories could amplify their cause on the world stage. In Asia, leaders in newly independent states or those emerging from colonial rule observed Egypt's strategic approach to balancing superpower interests. Countries like Indonesia and Burma evaluated the potential of leveraging Cold War rivalries to safeguard sovereignty while pursuing domestic development. Nasser's skillful navigation of UN mechanisms, media influence, and superpower diplomacy offered a blueprint for smaller nations seeking to maximize agency in a bipolar world order. The Suez Crisis underscored the efficacy of combining assertive domestic policy with international legal and political frameworks, encouraging nations to assert control over resources, infrastructure, and governance in ways that reinforced both economic and political independence. Beyond practical strategy, the crisis reinforced the ideological dimension of decolonization. Anti-colonial movements increasingly framed their struggles in terms of moral legitimacy, international law, and self-determination. Suez illustrated that these concepts were not abstract ideals, but actionable tools capable of constraining powerful nations and achieving tangible results. This ideological framework guided negotiations, armed resistance, and political organizing throughout Africa and Asia, reinforcing the centrality of sovereignty, national pride, and strategic foresight in the post-colonial era. Consequently, the Suez Crisis became both a model and a catalyst for movements seeking to dismantle imperial structures, laying the foundation for a wave of independence and nation-building in the 1960s and beyond. The Suez Crisis also had profound implications for the formation and consolidation of the non-aligned movement, NAM. Nations that sought to avoid direct alignment with either the United States or the Soviet Union found in Egypt's strategy a model of asserting autonomy in a polarized world. Nasser emerged as a central figure in shaping the ideology of non-alignment, emphasizing that smaller or recently independent nations could exercise strategic independence, navigate superpower pressures, and maintain sovereignty while pursuing economic development and regional influence. The principles demonstrated during the crisis, strategic nationalization of resources, multilateral diplomacy, and leveraging international legitimacy, became core tenets of non-aligned strategy. Countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America began coordinating efforts in forums such as the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung and subsequent NAM gatherings, using the lessons of Suez to negotiate trade, secure development aid, and resist coercion from superpowers. Suez highlighted that influence did not solely derive from military strength, but also from the ability to mobilize international support, exercise strategic foresight, and present a coherent, morally persuasive narrative. Finally, the crisis fostered a sense of solidarity among post-colonial nations, encouraging collaboration in trade, political advocacy, and regional security initiatives. It reinforced the idea that sovereignty and self-determination were not passive ideals, but active strategies requiring careful planning, alliance management, and international engagement. The Suez Crisis, therefore, extended beyond the immediate military and political events of 1956. It reshaped global consciousness, inspiring a generation of leaders to pursue independence, regional influence, and global legitimacy in ways that would define the geopolitics of the global South for decades. The Suez Crisis of 1956 fundamentally reshaped perceptions of global infrastructure security, particularly regarding the Suez Canal, one of the most strategically vital waterways in the world, linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. The canal facilitated the shortest maritime route between Europe and Asia, making it critical for international trade, especially oil shipments, manufactured goods, and raw materials. Egypt's nationalization of the canal highlighted the vulnerability of globally significant infrastructure when sovereignty, political ambitions, and economic interests intersect. For decades, the canal had been controlled by foreign powers, with the British and French holding significant operational and financial stakes. Its nationalization underscored the broader post-colonial assertion of economic independence and strategic autonomy, sending shockwaves through global commerce and prompting nations to reassess the security of critical trade arteries. The immediate military crisis following nationalization revealed the extent to which global trade was dependent on a single choke point. Allied powers, including Britain and France, mobilized military forces not merely to protect commercial interests, but also to safeguard national prestige and influence in the Middle East. The disruption of canal operations had cascading effects on shipping insurance, port logistics, commodity pricing, and supply chains. Nations reliant on uninterrupted access to Middle Eastern oil, particularly Western European states, faced economic strain, demonstrating how geopolitical instability in a critical transit corridor could ripple throughout the global economy. Strategically, the Suez Canal became a case study in the relationship between territorial control, infrastructure security, and global trade stability. Governments worldwide recognized that maintaining access to vital infrastructure could not rely solely on historical agreements or foreign occupation. Instead, it required a combination of diplomatic engagement, regional cooperation, and, when necessary, defensive capabilities to protect strategic assets. The crisis demonstrated that nationalization of key infrastructure could be both a potent assertion of sovereignty and a flashpoint for international conflict, shaping the way nations approached critical trade routes, ports, and logistical networks for decades to come. The Suez Crisis highlighted nationalization as a powerful tool for asserting sovereignty and economic leverage. By taking control of the canal, Egypt not only reclaimed revenue previously flowing to foreign stakeholders, but also acquired a mechanism to influence international commerce and diplomacy. Canal tolls became a significant source of national revenue, funding infrastructure projects, modernization initiatives, and social programs. This demonstrated that strategically critical infrastructure could be leveraged to advance economic development, while simultaneously strengthening political and military autonomy. Nationalization, however, also carried profound geopolitical risks. Britain and France viewed Egypt's actions as a direct threat to their global interests, precipitating military intervention to protect both financial and strategic stakes. The resulting conflict revealed the tensions inherent in the post-colonial era. newly independent states sought to exercise control over their economies and resources, while former colonial powers and global markets resisted perceived losses. The interplay between national sovereignty and global economic interdependence became starkly evident, emphasizing the need for careful diplomatic navigation when asserting control over key assets. Beyond Egypt, the Suez Crisis inspired broader discussions regarding the nationalization of critical infrastructure worldwide. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia observed the Egyptian example as a model for asserting control over natural resources, ports, railways, and energy production. These actions demonstrated that sovereignty could be exercised economically as well as politically and militarily. At the same time, the international response underscored the necessity of managing global perceptions, negotiating strategically with superpowers, and balancing assertive national policy with broader economic realities. Nationalization became a sophisticated instrument of statecraft, intertwining economic policy, strategic positioning, and international law, a lesson whose reverberations would be felt in global energy, mining, and trade policies for decades. The Suez Crisis also had profound implications for the governance of global trade and the regulation of critical infrastructure. The disruption of canal operations prompted international actors to reconsider how globally significant assets should be managed, protected, and regulated. The crisis highlighted the need for cooperative mechanisms to ensure stability, predictability, and security in international commerce, foreshadowing debates around multilateral oversight of trade routes, ports, and pipelines. Countries realized that unilateral control over strategic assets could lead to conflict, but at the same time, sovereignty could not be indefinitely subordinated to foreign interests without provoking resistance. In response, the United Nations and other international bodies increasingly emphasize the importance of neutral, multinational approaches to safeguarding global infrastructure. The creation of a United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, during the Suez Crisis demonstrated that international oversight could stabilize conflict zones while maintaining the sovereignty of the host nation. These developments influenced subsequent approaches to global trade governance, including the management of choke points, navigation rights, and dispute resolution mechanisms in international waters. The principle that strategic infrastructure required both sovereign control and multilateral oversight became a central lesson, informing treaties, conventions, and global economic frameworks for decades. Economically, the crisis prompted nations to diversify supply chains, establish strategic reserves, and develop alternative routes for critical goods. Shipping companies and governments invested in infrastructure resilience, recognizing that a single point of disruption could have cascading global effects. The Suez Canal became a symbol of both opportunity and vulnerability, shaping policies around energy security, maritime law, and international commerce. The long-term impact of the crisis was a heightened awareness of the interdependence between national sovereignty, infrastructure control, and global economic stability, a lesson that continues to influence policy decisions in strategic regions around the world. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a pivotal moment in the history of media and its impact on international politics. For the first time, a regional conflict involving global powers played out extensively on the screens and newspapers of audiences worldwide in near real time. Television broadcasts, radio coverage, and print journalism brought the crisis into homes across Europe, the Middle East, and North America, allowing the public to witness both military operations and the humanitarian consequences of the war. Images of bombed towns, displaced civilians, and advancing troops conveyed the immediacy of the conflict, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, morality, and political responsibility. For Britain and France, media coverage became a double-edged sword. Initially, state-aligned narratives sought to frame the military intervention as a necessary defense of international shipping lanes and national interests. Newspapers lauded the skill of the military and the decisiveness of political leadership. Yet as the operation progressed and international condemnation mounted, independent reporting began highlighting the human cost of the conflict and the political miscalculations of the intervention. Graphic images of destroyed infrastructure, crowded refugee movements, and civilian casualties intensified public scrutiny, undermining confidence in leadership and fueling political opposition at home. Media reporting demonstrated the power of information to shape public opinion and, indirectly, the course of military and diplomatic decision-making. The international reach of media coverage amplified the crisis on the global stage. In the United States, newspapers and television networks emphasized the diplomatic tension between Washington and London/Paris, portraying the Anglo-French-Israeli operation as reckless and destabilizing. In Egypt and across the Arab world, state media and newspapers framed Nasser as a heroic leader defending sovereignty against imperialist aggression. Propaganda campaigns highlighted Egyptian resilience, celebrated military achievements, and emphasized the moral dimension of nationalization. This dual narrative, the Western critique of intervention versus Arab celebration of resistance, demonstrated how media could influence perceptions of legitimacy, galvanize public opinion, and create political pressure on both domestic and international leaders. Propaganda played a central role in shaping both domestic and international responses to the Suez Crisis. In Egypt, Nasser's government skillfully managed information to present the nationalization of the Suez Canal as an assertion of sovereignty and a defense of Arab dignity. State-controlled radio broadcasts, newspapers, and public speeches highlighted Egypt's moral high ground, emphasizing the illegal interference of Britain and France and framing Israel as a proxy in a larger imperialist agenda. Symbols of Egyptian resistance, including the mobilization of the military, the display of national unity, and the portrayal of foreign troops as aggressors, were amplified to strengthen domestic cohesion and project power externally. In Britain and France, governments struggled to control the narrative in an environment of increasingly independent media. Press coverage exposed strategic miscalculations, economic repercussions, and the escalating costs of intervention. Cartoons, editorials, and investigative reporting criticized the motives behind the operation, questioning whether national prestige justified the financial and diplomatic risks. Television, emerging as a dominant medium in both nations, brought moving images of destruction and military maneuvers into living rooms, heightening the sense of urgency and moral scrutiny. Public protests and parliamentary debates reflected the growing influence of media, showing that information dissemination could directly impact political outcomes and leadership credibility. Internationally, propaganda battles shaped superpower involvement. The United States leveraged media to underscore its disapproval of unilateral military action by Britain and France, framing the crisis as a threat to global stability and economic order. Soviet propaganda, in turn, presented the conflict as evidence of Western imperialism, amplifying anti-colonial sentiment and positioning the USSR as a defender of national sovereignty. Each actor recognized that controlling the narrative could influence global opinion, sway diplomatic decisions, and legitimize or delegitimize military actions. The Suez Crisis, therefore, illustrated the emerging reality that conflicts were fought not only on the battlefield, but also in the sphere of public perception, media framing, and ideological influence. The Suez Crisis had lasting implications for how governments, militaries and international organizations approached media management and public diplomacy in times of conflict. Leaders recognized that traditional secrecy was insufficient in an age of instant information, where images and narratives could shape international perception and constrain policy choices. The crisis demonstrated that media could amplify political consequences, making domestic support and international legitimacy as critical to operational success as tactical victories on the ground. In Egypt, the successful use of media and propaganda enhanced Nasser's credibility, both domestically and internationally, and provided a model for combining nationalist messaging with strategic diplomacy. His ability to project strength and moral authority influenced future leaders across the global South, demonstrating that perception could be as important as material power in asserting sovereignty. For Western powers, the crisis highlighted the risks of underestimating media influence, prompting reforms in military communications, press relations, and public messaging strategies. Governments began to recognize that controlling information flow, anticipating media impact, and responding proactively to public scrutiny were essential components of modern conflict management. The Suez Crisis also foreshadowed the rise of televised international crises, where global audiences could witness events as they unfolded. Media became a strategic tool in shaping international norms, rallying domestic support, and constraining or legitimizing military action. The interplay between reporting, propaganda, and public perception revealed a new dimension of geopolitical strategy, in which the narrative itself became a form of power. In this way, the Suez Crisis not only reshaped Middle Eastern geopolitics, but also transformed the relationship between war, media, and global political consciousness, leaving lessons that continue to inform military, diplomatic, and media strategies in the 21st century. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was not merely a regional conflict. It fundamentally reshaped global power dynamics in the post-World War II era. The crisis exposed the declining capacity of traditional European powers, Britain and France, to act unilaterally on the world stage without facing economic, political, and diplomatic consequences from emerging superpowers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. The military intervention, though tactically successful in the short term, revealed that the projection of traditional imperial power had limitations in an era defined by nuclear deterrence, economic interdependence, and international law. Britain and France's humbling during the crisis accelerated the decolonization process, highlighting that European influence could no longer be enforced purely through military might. Their inability to maintain control over the Suez Canal without U.S. support demonstrated a stark geopolitical shift, marking the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant actors shaping regional outcomes. This realignment had lasting implications. Europe increasingly relied on alliances such as NATO and economic partnerships to exert influence, while post-colonial nations began asserting their sovereignty with greater confidence, knowing that superpower support or opposition could dramatically affect outcomes. The Suez Crisis also underscored the interdependence of military, economic, and diplomatic power. Britain and France learned that operational success on the battlefield could be nullified by international economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. For emerging nations, the crisis became a blueprint for leveraging strategic assets, international opinion, and global institutions to achieve sovereignty. The lessons of Suez informed foreign policy, military planning, and international relations for decades, demonstrating that power in the modern era required not only force, but also legitimacy, strategic alliances, and economic resilience. Beyond geopolitics, the Suez Crisis had profound implications for international law, norms, and conflict resolution. Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal challenged the established legal and economic structures controlled by foreign powers and raised questions about sovereignty, control over strategic resources, and the limits of intervention. The crisis underscored that the unilateral use of military force to protect commercial or national interests was increasingly constrained by emerging norms of international law, multilateralism, and the authority of institutions such as the United Nations. The deployment of a United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, following the crisis set a precedent for international peacekeeping operations, demonstrating the effectiveness of neutral, multinational intervention to stabilize conflict zones while respecting the sovereignty of the host nation. UNEF's success influenced subsequent peacekeeping missions worldwide, establishing norms for operational conduct, impartiality, and coordination between local authorities and international actors. The crisis illustrated that military solutions had to be integrated with legal frameworks and multilateral mechanisms to achieve lasting stability. Suez also prompted discussions on economic governance and infrastructure security within international law. The closure and control of a vital trade route highlighted the tension between national sovereignty and global economic interdependence. The crisis became a case study for developing treaties, conventions, and norms regarding the management of strategic assets, access rights, and dispute resolution. By linking sovereignty with global accountability, Suez influenced legal discourse on the responsibilities of nations controlling critical infrastructure and highlighted the emerging importance of international law in shaping the outcomes of conflicts in an interconnected world. The long-term legacy of the Suez Crisis extended into strategy, international relations, and national policy for decades. For Egypt, the successful nationalization and resistance against intervention cemented Nasser's position as a leader of Arab nationalism, inspiring post-colonial movements worldwide. The crisis demonstrated the value of strategic foresight, alliance building, and the skillful use of both media and international institutions to achieve political objectives. Egypt's example informed how newly independent nations approach sovereignty, resource control, and engagement with superpowers. For Israel, Britain, and France, the lessons were multifaceted. Israel gained tactical validation of its military capabilities, but learned that diplomatic constraints could override battlefield successes. Britain and France recognized that traditional notions of global influence required adaptation in the nuclear age, where economic leverage and multilateral diplomacy could be more decisive than force alone. For the United States and the Soviet Union, Suez affirmed the significance of the Middle East as a theater of strategic competition and highlighted the efficacy of indirect influence, economic sanctions, and diplomatic engagement in shaping regional outcomes. Ultimately, the Suez Crisis established enduring lessons for global conflict management. It highlighted the interplay between military operations, economic stability, media influence, and international norms. The event emphasized the importance of legitimacy, strategic communication, and coalition building in modern conflict, and it underscored the risks inherent in unilateral action against sovereign nations. The crisis shaped the conduct of Cold War diplomacy, guided post-colonial statecraft, and informed the development of international institutions. Its lessons remain relevant for contemporary geopolitics, reminding nations that power is multidimensional, globalized, and dependent on both perception and principle as much as on military strength. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Suez Crisis of 1956. Today, we explored how a single canal could ignite a global confrontation, how Egypt's bold nationalization challenged empires, and how superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union reshaped the outcome. We saw the lessons in military strategy, diplomacy, media influence, economic leverage, and the enduring power of nationalism. The moral of this story? Power is never just about armies or weapons. It's about strategy, perception, alliances, and the courage to assert sovereignty. It teaches us that nations, big or small, can influence the course of history when they combine foresight with determination. If you've enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to subscribe to History Teller YT for more stories that unravel the events shaping our world. Hit the like button, share this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an epic history tale. We'll see you in the next story, where more secrets of the past await and more lessons of history will come alive.